Chapter 2784. It was at this moment that Luo Fan truly understood the vastness of the tribulation layer. The vastness of the tribulation layer far exceeded his imagination. It could even be said that the entire simulation of the primal chaos could be seen as one with the tribulation layer. Almost as far as he could see, there were traces of the tribulation layer within the range of the simulated chaotic state. To put it in an extreme way, the simulated chaotic state could even be seen as branches and leaves growing from the foundation of the tribulation layer. The complexity of the tribulation layer was also proportional to its vastness. Although it seemed to be just a simulated chaotic state, the tiny units contained in the tribulation layer were billions and trillions of times more than the transportation network layer. It could be said that even if the tiny particles in the transportation network layer were described as the quantity of heaven and earth, the units in the tribulation layer might not be able to contain all of them. For example, the tribulation that the transportation network layer had endured and the tribulation that many heavens and earths had endured was actually just an insignificant change in an insignificant point in the tribulation layer. Compared to the entire tribulation layer, this insignificant change wasn't even enough to spread the aftermath. The moment the change disappeared, the tribulation layer had already annihilated all the aftermath. After seeing this tribulation layer clearly, Luo Fan clearly understood how difficult it was for him to break through this simulated primal chaos state and transcend this simulated primal chaos state. Fortunately, he had already condensed the light of heaven and earth, and the various powers and divine abilities that were based on the light of heaven and earth had been recovered by him. Therefore, this possibility was not completely impossible. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart trembled. The light of heaven and earth around him condensed, and dimensions were born out of thin air. These dimensions enveloped the entire transportation network layer, as if dividing it into layers. In the blink of an eye, the transportation network layer had been divided into billions of parts, or rather, billions of layers. Each dimension represented a layer. Among them, each dimension represented the transportation network layer, as well as a certain characteristic of the many heaven and earth within it. With such a change, the transportation network layer and the transportation network layer were divided into billions of parts. On the whole, whether it was the transportation network layer or the many heaven and earth within it, there were no changes. They were still the same as before. They were still perfect and flawless, and they were still perfect and flawless. They still had the characteristics that they were supposed to have. However, from another perspective, at least from Luo Fan's point of view, everything had changed dramatically. Because of this division, the tribulation that was originally aimed at the many heaven and earth had also begun to be divided. On the whole, it was still aimed at those heaven and earth, and it was still indirectly aimed at the transportation network layer itself. However, for each dimension, there was a slight difference in the number of tribulations. The power of the tribulations encountered in different dimensions differed greatly. Some dimensions gathered more tribulations power, while others were completely ignored by the tribulations power. Even the dimensions that had gathered more power from the tribulations had different reactions under the power of the tribulations. Some dimensions almost collapsed under the suppression of the tribulations, while others began to grow rapidly under the tribulations' power. Of course, whether it was the collapse or the growth, it was a change that broke the balance of the dimensions. In the end, it would be reflected on the heaven and earth or the transportation network layer as a whole, and it would be enough to push it towards the abyss of destruction. Although Luo Fan saw the signs of the great tribulations that the transportation network layer was experiencing, he had no intention of stopping them. After seeing the true appearance of the tribulation layer, Luo Fan already knew that if he continued to be entangled in the tribulation's power, he would be endlessly tested again and again by the tribulation's power. Not to mention transcending this simulated state of chaos. It might even be destroyed by this tribulation at any time. Don't forget, according to the laws of the simulated state of chaos, the world of laws had just passed through 3 great tribulations of the world. There are still 6 more great tribulations waiting for it. After the transportation network layer was divided into billions of dimensions, the tribulation layer that was originally one also divided into billions of shadows. This situation was naturally not, because Luo Fan's ability to divide dimensions had spread to the tribulation layer and divided the tribulation layer into billions of dimensions. After all, the divided dimensions didn't exist in the first place. The reason why Luo Fan could divide dimensions in the transportation network layer was because he was the architect of the transportation network layer, and he had unimaginable authority in the transportation network layer. When he divided the dimensions, it seemed like he had done it independently, but in fact, it was done with the assistance of the transportation network layer. Obviously, he couldn't have such convenience for the tribulation layer. Therefore, it was obviously impossible for him to divide the dimensions of the tribulation layer. Since it wasn't the dimension that divided the tribulation layer, why did such a shadow appear when he looked at the tribulation layer now? Of course, it was because of the different perspective. It was just like an ordinary person. If they didn't have a brain to adjust it, they would probably see two relatively illusory images of the same object with both eyes. That was when two eyes looked at the same object. Because the position of the two eyes was different, the angle of looking at the object would also be different. Naturally, the position of the object would be different from the perspective of the two eyes. For example, the object in the left eye was at this position, but in the right eye, it was empty and there was no object at all. With such an overlapping perspective, the image of the object would naturally become somewhat illusory. It was the same for what the other eye saw. Therefore, without a brain to integrate these two perspectives, anyone looking at any object would only see two different shadows of the object, each of which was slightly off from its original position. At this moment, the reason why Luo Fan was looking at the shadow in the tribulation layer was actually similar to how an ordinary person would look at an object without a brain to adjust the perspective. Because the dimensions in the transportation network layer had already been divided, the tribulation passageways that were originally poured into the transportation network layer were also divided due to the division of the dimensions in the transportation network layer. In this way, when one traced back to the tribulation layer, although this division didn't appear because of the residual perception in the hearts of living beings, the tribulation layers that were connected to the different dimensions in the tribulation layer were obviously connected to different dimensions in the tribulation layer. If there was a division in the tribulation layer, there would naturally be nothing to say. That would mean that the value of the billions of different dimensions in the tribulation layer had dropped. However, it was obvious that the tribulation layer hadn't been divided yet. In this way, the tribulation passageways that extended from different dimensions were connected to a whole entity. That was the whole of the tribulation layer. In this way, there was a difference between the residual perception in the heart and the real tribulation layer. The appearance of this difference naturally caused countless shadow images to appear in the tribulation layer. From a certain perspective, these shadow images could actually be considered as the shadow images produced by the mixing of many dimensions in the tribulation layer. Although it was a division that occurred in the illusory perception, in essence, it wasn't much different from the real division. Through such a change, the originally flawless and perfect tribulation layer had unknowingly revealed a completely different appearance. Many flaws and loopholes that originally didn't exist and were concealed by the perfect state were also unknowingly revealed. Tribulation realm. With a slight thought, Luo Fan secretly made a decision. His main body left the world of laws on its own and rushed towards the sky. In the blink of an eye, he found a loophole and rushed into the tribulation layer. As he disappeared, the transportation network layer began to shake violently. It seemed that some kind of foundation had disappeared, and the entire transportation network layer was about to collapse along with that foundation. What does this mean? At this moment, the heavenly Tao of the world of laws appeared outside the world of laws. It raised its head and looked at the tribulation layer above the transportation network layer with shock and bewilderment in its eyes. It couldn't believe what had just happened. The creator of the world of laws had completely abandoned the world of laws and the transportation network layer. He had clearly put in so much effort for the realm of laws and the transportation network layer, and had schemed against so many world founders. But now, he had abandoned it like it was nothing more than chewing gum. How could not be puzzled by such a situation? But soon, the heavenly Tao knew that this was a great opportunity for it. It didn't lament over Luo Fan's strange choice and returned to the world of laws in a flash. Immediately after, it used its extraordinary authority to directly control the entire world of laws and instantly stabilized the world of laws, returning it to its original stable state in the blink of an eye. This was naturally an extremely easy thing for the heavenly Tao to do. One must know that even when Luo Fan was in this world of laws, he didn't care about the specific matters at all. Everything that needed to truly stabilize the world of laws, as well as everything that needed to be done to control and manage the countless parallel places, was actually directly issued by the heavenly Tao. At most, what Luo Fan did was give a general direction. Under such a background, what the heavenly Tao did at this time was no different from what it had originally done. At most, it would just lose a shackle on its head with the heavenly Tao's actions, the transportation network layer, which had been constantly shaking and seemed like it was about to collapse, stabilized, and return to its original state. In fact, it was even faintly showing signs of becoming more stable and resilient than before. It seemed that the shaking this time had given the transportation network layer training, allowing it to grow sufficiently after this training. In fact, this was actually a matter of course. After all, the transportation network layer was no longer in the state where it was completely attached to the world of laws before it passed the layer tribulation. At this time, the transportation network layer was essentially a natural landscape that simulated the state of chaos. Such an existence that originally maintained its attachment to the world of laws was actually just like a toddler who was learning to walk. Even after gaining the ability to walk, it still couldn't help but hold onto a walker to move forward. It was just a kind of habit. If the walker was stable enough to support the child's continuous progress, it might take a long time for the child to throw it away. However, if the walker suddenly malfunctioned, causing the child to fall even though he was leaning on it, the time it would take for the child to throw the walker away would definitely be much faster. At this time, the transportation network layer was the child, and the world of laws was the walker. Just now, the sudden change in heaven and earth was equivalent to the walker suddenly breaking down. It made the child suddenly realize that having a walker wasn't always a worry-free thing to do. The walker could also break down, and relying on the walker could also cause one to fall. Once this was discovered, then the transportation network layer would naturally place more emphasis on its own capabilities. It was precisely because of this that the transportation network layer could naturally grow at this time and become more resilient, stable, and unshakable than before. The world founders naturally didn't care about all of this. At this time, they were only concerned about what exactly happened to the world of laws. Why did the transportation network layer suddenly show signs of shaking? Why is this happening? Did something happen to him? Or is it being targeted by a higher world? Some of the world creators guessed and were suddenly eager to give it a try. Chapter 2785. These world founders saw through the essence of the world and knew that even if they got rid of the world of laws and Luo Fan, they would only be changing to another world that shackled their world. There was no difference in essence from what they were facing now. In fact, the situation might even be worse because they were facing an unfamiliar world. Therefore, they suppressed the emotions in their hearts and didn't directly target the world of laws, nor did they target the worlds above them. However, this didn't mean that their emotions towards those existences that shackled and restricted their world had disappeared. It didn't mean that they weren't willing to see those worlds suffer. They just felt that it wouldn't be meaningful to target the world of laws, but it didn't mean that they had the obligation to protect the world of laws. On the contrary, if the realm of laws was in a bad situation and they were able to make the realm of laws suffer great loss, no world creator would reject such an offer. Therefore, at this time, in the face of the changes in the world of laws, these world founders who were eager to give it a try began to vent their frustrations of being shackled and shackled by the world. Streams of perception began to be released from the various realms, heading towards the realm of laws. They continuously seeped into the interior of the realm of laws in an attempt to observe the changes that had occurred to the realm of laws. This kind of behavior could be said to be very bold. If Luo Fan was still here, their actions would definitely bring disaster to their world. Although Luo Fan was no longer here, it was obvious that only the Heavenly Tao knew about this. For these world founders, they might have some guesses about this, but it was obviously impossible for them to be certain. The fact that they dared to do this in this uncertain state was enough to show what their mentality was like. In such a place that made them feel hopeless and hopeless, some world founders no longer cared about their own lives and interests. In other words, many world founders had unknowingly developed the mentality of self-destruction. For such a mentality of self-destruction, this kind of behavior that was highly likely to bring danger to their lives wasn't that unacceptable. Of course, such world founders were only in the minority. Therefore, only a few world founders really took action at this time. At this moment, the Heavenly Tao of the world of laws instantly sensed the arrival of these senses, and its expression suddenly changed. Do you think that without him, I'll turn into plasticine? He sneered and instantly manipulated the power of the world of laws to surge. The wisps of perception from the world's founders instantly materialized and were enveloped by the power of the world of laws. In that instant, the founders of the world suddenly felt that their perception of the world of laws had suddenly turned into a brand new shackle, a shackle that locked them up and kept pulling them in a certain direction. As this happened, the creators of the world instantly felt an indescribable sense of danger rise from the depths of their hearts. This feeling was so intense that it made them wonder if they were going to be smashed into smithereens in the next moment. As for their perception, they had become deaf and blind. They could only sense the unimaginable power of the shackles, but they couldn't sense anything else. Not to mention trying to investigate the situation inside the world of laws. Not good. This thought flashed through the minds of these world founders at this moment. Although there was a tendency to self-destruct in the depths of their hearts, it was in fact just a tendency in the depths of their hearts. It didn't mean that these world founders really yearned for death on the surface. They actually still had the desire to survive. At this moment, seeing that they might be chased by the powerful existences in the world of laws, they made a prompt decision and instantly tried to sever their own perception, completely cutting off the connection between the perception that had entered the world of laws and themselves. Obviously, it wasn't easy to succeed with this method. At the very least, the true successful world founders at this time were only about 10% of the world founders. The remaining 90% of the world founders could only feel a powerful backlash when they sent their will over, but they couldn't shake the perception at all. It was as if there was an invisible barrier covering the perception, protecting it. The faces of the world founders who severed the perception turned pale, and there was a lingering fear in their hearts. Severing the perception was actually nothing for existences at their level. After all, at their level, the perception that was incomparably vast in the eyes of ordinary cultivators seemed rather insignificant. However, this didn't mean that severing the perception just now didn't have a great impact on these world founders. Don't forget that the perception had already been grasped by the Heavenly Tao, and it had turned them into carriers for the shackles. Under such circumstances, how could the connection between perception and the pioneers of the universe be described as merely a connection of perception? It could be said that after the perception was attached to the shackles, it could be said that it had already become connected to the essence of these world founders. Under such circumstances, it was imaginable how great the impact on these world founders would be if their perception was completely severed. In that instant, he had forcefully severed his perception, which was equivalent to forcefully giving his own essence a fierce blow. Although the shackles only connected to their essence and didn't really integrate their essence into it, severing the perception wasn't considered as separating their essence. However, just the sudden impact alone was enough to make the creators of the world feel extremely uncomfortable, and they felt dizzy. However, none of these world founders regretted their decision just now. Every single one of them was incomparably glad that they made a prompt decision just now. After all, the shackles were connected to their essence. If they really allowed the shackles to work, wouldn't their essence be completely out of their control in the end? Such an outcome was something that these world founders couldn't understand. If they allowed this to continue, what awaited them wouldn't just be a simple impact on their essence. They might even become puppets, just like the world founders who didn't succeed in severing the perception. At this moment, the world founders were already dumbfounded. Terrifying wills constantly passed through the perception, or rather, the shackles constantly poured into their bodies, making their minds feel like they had fallen into a stormy sea, enduring wave after wave of overwhelming waves. If these world founders didn't have self-destructive tendencies deep in their hearts, the impact wouldn't have truly affected them, even if it was uncomfortable. However, it was clear that this didn't happen. The self-destructive tendencies deep in their hearts were like a broken egg, completely destroying the egg and allowing flies to freely suck the egg's liquid. At this moment, the world founders kept retreating in the face of the will of the heavenly way that was like a tidal wave. In the end, when they retreated to a certain limit, they couldn't take it anymore, and their consciousness was completely suppressed by the will of the heavenly way, turning them into puppets of the heavenly way. In other words, they had turned into existences similar to the heavenly way's incarnation. Along with this change, the world that the world founders had opened also began to undergo subtle changes. The entire world seemed to have suddenly been suppressed by some kind of invisible and terrifying power. Everything in the world seemed to have gained some kind of foundation in that instant. This kind of foundation was so subtle and strange. While it stabilized the world, it also caused all sorts of changes to occur in every aspect of the world. Most of these worlds had signs of impending tribulations. These signs no longer posed any threat to the world after the heavenly Tao took control of the creator of the world. They were easily neutralized by the power of the world. One must know that the world founders could be said to have become the incarnations of the heavenly way. For the heavenly way, sending incarnations to help other worlds resist the world calamities was a procedure that couldn't be more familiar with. It wasn't to the point that the incarnations didn't even need to spend any effort to analyze. They could instinctively make the most appropriate response by sensing the aura of the world and sensing the signs of changes. After the world founders were turned into puppets by the heavenly way, the positions of those worlds also began to shift in the transportation network layer. From the various other locations in the transportation network layer that were originally scattered all over the world, they gradually converged towards the center, where the rule of law was located. The entire process was extremely natural and subtle. It was as if there was an invisible line that was pulling the heavens and earth closer to the world of laws. Of course, due to the mysterious characteristics of the transportation network layer, while those worlds converged towards the world of laws, the other worlds were also easily brushed past like flowing water. When those worlds passed by the other worlds naturally made way for them. There was no collision at all. These changes made the other world founders' hair stand on end. This situation had simply subverted their worldview. They couldn't imagine why such a change would happen, and they couldn't understand why the world of laws would suddenly change its style. The entire change process lasted for dozens of days. After dozens of days, when all the world stabilized, there was already a rather perfect circle of protection around the world of laws. Many worlds were arranged in all directions, protecting the law heaven and earth in the center. Could it be that something really happened? At this moment, some of the more sensitive world founders had an inexplicable guess in their hearts. It turned out that they were disdainful of the theory that the world of laws might have suffered a loss in a battle with other worlds that they couldn't see. After all, whether it was Luo Fan's strength or the strangeness of his enemies, this theory didn't seem too credible. But at this moment, when they saw the actions of the Heaven Tao, they suddenly realized that perhaps that theory wasn't completely untrustworthy. After all, at this moment, the world of laws didn't seem to be that confident. It turned out that before the changes, the world of laws could be said to be completely disdainful of any future forces in foreign worlds. No matter how those worlds changed, no matter what choice the world founders made, even if they directly broke away from the transportation network layer and offended the world of laws couldn't be bothered to care. At most, they would give some world founders a punishment when they were too happy. As for building a defensive circle, it had never happened before. But now, what was the world of laws doing? It was building a defensive circle. Even if the materials used were worlds and world founders, building a defensive circle was still building a defensive circle. Under what circumstances would an intelligent life form build a defensive circle? Of course, it was when they felt that they weren't safe in the outside world. Only when they felt that they weren't safe would they spend their precious energy on building a defensive circle. This theory was clearly suitable for the world of laws. Previously, the world of laws disdained all provocations and targets, which meant that it didn't think that these provocations and targets would have any real impact on it. No matter what provocations and targets, as long as the world of laws wanted to deal with them, it would definitely be able to deal with them easily, regardless of how the other party developed. Under such circumstances, there was naturally no need to consider building a defensive circle. And at this moment, what the world of laws did clearly meant that it had lost its confidence. He had lost the confidence that no matter what kind of provocation or what was aimed at him, he would be able to deal with it whenever he wanted to. There was obviously only one possibility for the world of laws to lose this confidence, and that was that it had suffered a loss in a battle with a certain existence. All kinds of speculations appeared in the hearts of more and more world founders, making them eager to give it a try. Chapter 2786. At this moment, more and more world founders began to be eager to give it a try. However, with the lessons of the previous world founders, even if they were eager to give it a try, they would definitely not take action immediately. Instead, they planned to use various methods to probe and find a suitable opportunity to make a move. With the emergence of this mentality, the atmosphere in the entire transportation network layer unknowingly underwent an inexplicable change. Originally, the tranquility of the transportation network layer was like a pool of stagnant water. The reason why everyone remained calm and did not take action was because they had completely lost hope. And now, after the change in the atmosphere, the entire transportation network layer was also calm on the surface. However, this calmness was like the calm before the storm. Most of the world seemed to be watching for something, as if they were waiting for an opportunity to arrive. Although the Heavenly Tao's ability to control the world was not much inferior to Luo Fan's, it was still the Heavenly Tao after all. Even though Luo Fan had given it a lot of authority that was not the Heavenly Tao, and many things in the transportation network layer were handed over to the Heavenly Tao incarnation to handle. However, the Heavenly Tao was the Heavenly Tao, and it was impossible for it to become a world founder because of this. Since it was not a world founder, it was naturally impossible for it to have the spirit of a world founder, and it was impossible for it to have the concept of a world founder. It did not even have its own unique worldview. The choices made by such a Heavenly Tao, which it thought was perfect, were full of loopholes in the eyes of a true world founder. Therefore, at this moment, even though the Heavenly Tao had made such a mistake and seemed to have become a fish on the chopping board, it still did not notice it at all. Instead, it still looked at the many world founders in the transportation network layer with the mentality of having Luo Fan as a backer, and even looked at the endless world outside the transportation network layer. No matter what, those world founders were existences that had formed their own unique worldview. After vaguely confirming that something might have happened to Luo Fan, the probing that they might make was obviously not simple. The choice of directly using one's perception to explore the world of laws had long since been proven to be impossible by the previous creators of the world. Under such circumstances, they would naturally choose a more subtle method to deal with the situation. This more subtle method was to use one's own worldview and the mysterious power of creation that one had grasped as the creator of the world to influence the various subtle existences in the world from afar. Through this influence, that subtle existence would undergo some subtle changes. In the end, through this change, they could pry into some of the truths they wanted to pry into. For example, how weak had Luo Fan become? Or what had this world experienced previously? How badly was it damaged now? For example, when would they have the opportunity to destroy the world of laws? If this had happened in the past, when Luo Fan was still in the world of laws, this kind of spying naturally wouldn't have been a big deal. With Luo Fan's mastery of the world of laws and the perfection of his worldview of laws, he could definitely lock onto these subtle changes that did not belong to the worldview of laws in an instant. He could even use these subtle changes to invade the source world, causing the creators of the world to go for wool and come home shorn. However, it was clear that Luo Fan was no longer in the realm of laws. He had already entered the tribulation level and had even set off battles that the creators of the world couldn't understand at all. Now, in this world of laws, the one who had full authority over the entire world of laws was the heavenly Tao, which didn't even have its own unique worldview. Under such circumstances, the subtle changes that the creators of the world, guided from afar, didn't encounter any obstacles at all. They completely followed the intentions of the creators and began to display their greatest effects in the realm of laws, causing the subtle changes to unexpectedly take shape. This change made the creators of the world somewhat unable to believe it for a moment. This was just a probing method. What did it mean by a probing method? It meant that they needed to use this method to see how the other party would respond. And through this response, they could see some things that they couldn't see before. But now, this kind of probing method actually didn't trigger any reaction from the other party at all. It felt like it was an open public toilet that anyone could enter and complete their goals in. How could the creators of the world, who were already prepared to be pushed back by force, not be shocked by this feeling? However, it was clear that Luo Fan's accumulated power was too strong. Don't forget that ever since they encountered Luo Fan, they were practically toyed with in the palm of his hand. Their world was distorted, and their views were distorted. Now, they were directly shackled to the transportation network and were firmly locked by the extended shackles. Even their lives were only preserved because he wasn't interested in it. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan's existence had long become a huge pressure in their hearts. The greatest manifestation of his pressure was that they even had to worry in their dreams that Luo Fan would suddenly come knocking on their door. In this way, how could the creators of the world feel that Luo Fan couldn't resist the current changes in the realm of laws just because of an unexpected change? Even if this unexpected change seemed to only appear in existences that couldn't resist, it was still the same. At this moment, the many creators of the world began to contact each other, sharing the information of their probing and discussing what to do next. Of course, the results of their probing were rather perfect for them. Although they didn't dare to directly go knocking on Luo Fan's door due to his accumulated power, the hearts of many creators were actually filled with surging emotions. At this moment, too many inspirations actually appeared in their minds out of nowhere. If that person really can't resist, then perhaps we can. The more they guessed, the more excited they became. Vaguely, their bodies even began to tremble. Of course, there was a precondition for all these ideas, which was that Luo Fan really couldn't resist at all. Once Luo Fan had the slightest ability to resist, their many ideas would only lead to their deaths. Therefore, before they could truly implement these inspirations, they still had a lot of work to do. The results of the discussions between the many creators clearly confirmed each other's thoughts. Although they still couldn't break Luo Fan's accumulated power, this mutual confirmation gave them more courage. As a result, their probing actions became even bolder. All sorts of strange and subtle powers that were based on their unique worldviews began to be unleashed by these world founders in extremely obscure ways, constantly converging towards the world of laws. This time, the situation was different from before. The bolder the probing actions, the more obvious the traces left behind. And the more obvious the traces, the easier it was for the heavenly Tao to sense them. Therefore, this time, the probing actions of the vast majority of the world founders were detected by the heavenly Tao that controlled all authority over the realm of laws. Although this heavenly Tao didn't have a unique worldview, it was ultimately the heavenly Tao of the realm of laws. After being given almost all authority over the realm of laws by Luo Fan, it was naturally able to use a part of the power of the realm of laws. At the very least, some of the more obvious changes caused by the power of the realm of laws weren't difficult for it to deal with. However, borrowed power was ultimately only borrowed, compared to the various powers triggered by the unique realm of laws that it had mastered. Even the weakest existence of a unique realm of laws would definitely have a huge gap in flexibility and applicability. Therefore, wanting to use the borrowed power of the realm of laws to fight against the world founders was obviously just a pipe dream. However, it was clear that some of the means that the pioneers of the world had displayed this time were too great, and they had reached a level that could be sensed by the worldview that was borrowed from the laws. Therefore, it was directly grabbed by the heavenly Tao and instantly severed. For a time, many of the world founders suddenly felt extremely panicked. At this time, they even suspected that all the changes before were just Luo Fan's entrapment. In an instant, they wanted to completely cut off all thoughts about the realm of laws. They just wished that time could go back and everything that had happened before never happened. In fact, even those who hadn't been discovered and hadn't been severed quickly retreated at this moment. They retracted their techniques and looked at the world with vigilance. Obviously, they were also worried that Luo Fan was entrapping them. After all, although their probing wasn't targeted, who knew if it was just a matter of sequence? Perhaps it was because they were decisive enough and withdrew their means, which allowed them to avoid losses. In the face of such a situation, it was self-evident what the choice of the world founders would make. For a time, the atmosphere of the entire transportation network became anxious again, as if there was an inexplicable panic brewing and reverberating between the worlds. The counterattack of Luo Fan that many of the world founders were waiting for did not come. Although the heavenly Tao discovered the overly obvious probing of the world founders, it was ultimately only borrowing the power of Luo Fan's realm of laws. The probing perception of the world founders was like looking at a flower through a fog, or like scratching an itch through a boot. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't get to the main point. Under such circumstances, being able to sever this connection was already a sufficiently brilliant use of the heavenly Tao's realm of laws. How could they directly find out where the probing came from? If they couldn't determine this, they naturally couldn't directly return to those worlds to retaliate. As for directly punishing everything in the entire transportation network layer regardless of the consequences, such a thing was even more unthinkable. Not to mention that the heavenly Tao couldn't do it. Even if it could, doing so would only expose its weakness and powerlessness, and it wouldn't achieve its goal at all. In contrast, remaining still like this could instead give the world founders more scruples. Although this scruple couldn't last for too long, at least there wouldn't be any problems in the short term. I didn't expect the difference to be so big between facing them and facing them through a layer. In the realm of laws, the heavenly Tao recalled all the previous probing and had such a thought. His expression turned a little ugly. Originally, when Luo Fan was supporting him from behind, the many worlds were like stinking ditches to him, and the world founders were like bugs living in the stinking ditches. He could need them however he wanted and seize the authority of those worlds. He didn't feel the slightest bit of difficulty at all, but he didn't expect that after losing Luo Fan's support, those bugs would suddenly turn into dragons, and the stinking ditches would suddenly turn into heavenly rivers. This made him suddenly feel an unimaginable sense of powerlessness. At this moment, he truly felt how dangerous his situation was. If he wasn't careful, he would be completely torn apart like a piece of paper. At this time, he began to try his best to sense the world of laws that had integrated into the realm of laws and try to mobilize the power of this world of laws so that it was in an absolutely active state. The power of the world of laws wasn't something he could control perfectly. The only thing he could do was to forcefully adjust his worldview and force it to play according to his will. Under such circumstances, directly distorting the power of the worldview to carry out the protection of the world was very likely to be like a sieve with countless loopholes. If an ordinary existence faced such a situation, they would obviously be helpless. However, this heavenly Tao was ultimately the heavenly Tao of the realm of laws, and it was a wonderful existence that Luo Fan constructed from nothing. Faced with this absolutely terrible situation, he came up with a solution. This solution was what he was doing at this time. He wanted to make the world of laws that had integrated into the realm of laws become active. Through this change, the world of laws would no longer passively endure everything like before, and it would begin to take the initiative. Chapter 2787. This repelling effect made it so that once the power of any worldview invaded this world, it would inevitably trigger a corresponding change in the worldview. This change was obviously the best hint to the heavenly Tao. Due to the fact that the heavenly Tao was a borrowed worldview, it did not feel much about the changes caused by the power of the worldview that usually had no foundation and seemed extremely obscure. However, it was impossible for it not to sense the changes in the world caused by the change in the worldview. Even if the change was weak, it was still the same. Therefore, it could be said that triggering the worldview and making it take the initiative was obviously the best way for the heavenly Tao to deal with the probing of the many founders of the world. With the appearance of this change, the heavenly Tao was slightly relieved. With this, his safety would be guaranteed for a very long period of time. What exactly is the worldview? After calming down a little, the heavenly Tao began to think about this question that he had never thought about before. For the heavenly Tao, the worldview was almost like a fine instrument in his hands that was completely under his control. All along, he had been able to easily use this instrument to do many things that the instrument itself could do. He could even innovate and use this instrument to create some new instruments. However, in fact, his understanding of the worldview itself was like an ordinary person's understanding of the fine instrument in their hands. They only knew how it was, but not why it was. In other words, they all knew what kind of behavior could trigger what kind of change, what kind of preparation could lead to what kind of result. However, why such behavior could trigger such a change, and why such preparation could lead to that result, was obviously a mystery to him. In the past, he was just a heavenly Tao, and he was only helping Luo Fan manage the world and even manage the entire transportation network. Naturally, all of this did not matter to him. In any case, no matter what, he was just an assistant. Why would he need to worry about the problem of a ruler like Luo Fan? But now his identity was completely different. He had become the ruler of this world, occupying the position that Luo Fan had previously occupied. In that case, Luo Fan's previous responsibilities were naturally his responsibility. The problem that Luo Fan had encountered previously naturally required the heavenly Tao to resolve itself. In this way, for the heavenly Tao, knowing how it was, but not knowing why it was clearly an unforgivable flaw. He gradually realized that his identity was different, and his responsibilities were different. The heavenly axiom, however, began to be interested in things like worldviews that he had no desire to explore before. When a living being began to understand the importance of the worldview, it meant that his perspective had been greatly expanded. It meant that his realm was completely different from before. At this moment, the heavenly Tao was exactly the same. As he began to think about the mysteries of the world, he gradually discovered that he seemed to have broken free from some invisible shackles. It was as if he had seen a brand new world, a brand new domain. I also need my own worldview, a unique worldview that is completely different from anyone else's, including my master's worldview. This thought emerged in his mind. As he thought of this, he suddenly felt that the world of laws was no longer as important to him as before, for an existence that had begun to sort out his unique worldview. The world that he was born in had already begun to degrade. It turned out that the world that he was born in had already begun to degrade from an indispensable foundation to a world that he felt was more special. Although the way in which the heavenly Tao was born was different from that of naturally born living beings, and was created by Luo Fan, it wasn't even a living being in essence. However, this didn't mean that the world of laws was different from his hometown to him. On the contrary, for the heavenly Tao, The relationship between him and the world of laws was even more intimate than the relationship between ordinary living beings and the world that they were born in. After all, no matter what, the heavenly Tao itself was an existence that was second only to the great Tao. It controlled almost all authority in the world. For such an existence, the world could almost be regarded as a part of its body. This relationship was obviously very different from the attitude that ordinary living beings had towards their homeland. At this time, as his perception of the worldview changed, the feeling of treating the world of laws as his own body gradually faded in the heavenly Tao's heart. Breaking free from the restrictions of the world of laws and breaking free from the restrictions of the worldview had unknowingly become the mainstream of his thoughts. From realizing the importance of the worldview to breaking free from the shackles of the world of laws and becoming the mainstream of his thoughts, tens of thousands of years had passed in the world of laws. Compared to the transportation network layer, these tens of thousands of years were thousands of years. During this period of time, none of the many heaven and earth founders in the transportation network layer dared to take more actions to test the world of laws and the owner of the world, Luo Fan, despite the danger that the heavenly Tao had brought to them back then. This choice was actually very natural. After all, for those heaven and earth founders, the reaction of the world of laws had already made them feel great pressure, and they even felt that they might die at that time. Under such dangerous emotions, how could they possibly take action against the world of laws again without waiting for the aftermath of the abnormal storm to dissipate? Obviously, the thousands of years in the transportation network layer was only a relatively short period of time for the many heaven and earth founders who had lived for billions of years. In such a short period of time, they obviously didn't think that the aftermath of the incident had dissipated. It was precisely because of this that they didn't take any action in the past thousands of years, even if they had doubts in their hearts, thinking that it wasn't that the unharmed heaven and earth founders reacted too quickly, but that the ruler of the world of laws didn't discover the test of the heaven and earth founders. During this period of time, the heaven and earth founders didn't dare to provoke the world of laws easily. The reason for this, of course, wasn't because they were afraid, but because if their guess was wrong, the danger to them would be too great. It was obviously not a wise choice to take such a risk for this unreliable conjecture in order to quickly test the laws of heaven and earth. With such a view, it wasn't surprising that the heaven and earth founders would make such a choice. However, as time passed, there would naturally be more and more heaven and earth founders who felt that the aftermath had dissipated and that the limelight had passed, so they could start a new round of tests. Therefore, after hundreds of years, there were finally heaven and earth founders who decided not to wait any longer. They began to prepare means to test the world of laws and try to see the current situation of the world of laws. If my incarnation hadn't completely integrated with the world of laws, why would I need to go through so much trouble? A heaven and earth founder had gone in millions of circles to infuse the power of his worldview bit by bit into the world of laws, but his heart was filled with inexplicable helplessness. One must know that if his incarnation hadn't become independent, it wouldn't have been as troublesome as it was now if they wanted to complete the test of the world of laws. At that time, they didn't even need to use any power. They only needed to let their incarnations mobilize some resources in the world of laws, and they would naturally be able to infuse their worldview into it to achieve the effect of the test. It was a pity that back then he had abandoned his incarnations for various reasons. Now, those incarnations had turned into the connection between the many parallel existences in the world of laws. It was almost impossible to find and sense them. Under such circumstances, he couldn't even confirm the position of his incarnations in the world of laws, let alone regain control of them. It was precisely because of this that he could only use such a complicated and boring method at this time. In fact, he didn't even dare to imagine that he would put in so much effort for such a small test of the world of laws. While he was sighing with emotion, some invisible existence in the world of laws began to surge violently. At this moment, the heavenly Tao that was working hard to sort out its unique world of laws suddenly trembled. Its perception gathered towards a certain parallel existence in the world of laws, along with the turbulence of the world of laws. In the blink of an eye, it locked onto the source of the turbulence of the world of laws. It was an invisible existence that even the heavenly Tao couldn't understand, and it didn't even know whether it existed or not. At this moment, this invisible existence was completely sealed by the heavenly Tao and finally fixed in the world of laws, causing the world of laws to become stagnant in an instant. It was as if the original flowing water had turned into a diamond. At this moment, the creator of the world, who had gone through millions of twists and turns to use his own world of laws to test the world of laws, felt that he was about to pee in his pants. What's going on? Such a strong counterattack and such a sharp reaction. Who told me that there's a problem with him? He exclaimed. Panicking like a stray dog, he instantly severed the existence that he had infiltrated into the world of laws. As this existence was severed, he felt a sharp pain in his body. It was as if some existence had forcibly grabbed his body and torn it to two sides, completely tearing it apart. This kind of existence that was attached to the power of the world of laws and displayed the essence of the world of laws was not an existence that could be severed like perception. Cutting off that kind of existence was almost equivalent to completely abandoning a part of one's world of laws, or even a large part of one's life essence. It went without saying how painful this feeling was. It could be said that the creator of the world did not fall into a coma at this time, and his mind did not collapse. This was already because he had acted with restraint. If he hadn't done it himself, and if other existences had directly severed it before he could react, his condition would definitely be tens of thousands of times worse. At this moment, the world that the creator of the world was instantly dimmed. The light intertwined with the light of other worlds, and finally returned to normal. It was as if there were no changes to the other worlds. At a glance, it was impossible to distinguish it from the other worlds. It was so much so that even the position of the world itself had shifted and was no longer in its original position. Evidently, in order to confuse himself as much as possible and avoid being discovered by Luo Fan, the creator of the world had done everything he could. He had even done many things that he originally thought he would never be able to do. At this moment, the heavens will let out a long sigh of relief. At least for now, his previous plan was effective. He had clearly completed his expectations of triggering the world of laws, and the effect on those powers that targeted the world of laws was unimaginably powerful. With this, I might be able to stay safe for a longer period of time. After experiencing such a long period of time, he had not completely sorted out his own worldview. However, it had already begun to take shape. This embryonic view of the world was not enough for him to truly establish a foothold in this simulated chaotic state. It was not enough for him to create a new world here, but it was enough for him to no longer be zero. It would no longer be impossible for him to escape from this world of laws, or even escape from the transportation network. With such a foundation, what he needed to do next was to continuously nurture and strengthen the embryonic form of this worldview, so that this embryonic form could finally become a complete worldview. Once he arrived at that step, it could be said that he would no longer be the heavens Tao, but the creator of the world. For ordinary cultivators, cultivating and strengthening the embryonic form of the worldview was much easier than establishing the embryonic form of the worldview, although it was much more complicated and troublesome. However, from the embryonic form of the worldview to the complete establishment of the worldview, it only required the accumulation of time and enough energy. However, it was clear that this was not the case for the Heavens Way. Chapter 2788. For ordinary cultivators, perfecting the embryonic form of this worldview and letting it grow into a true worldview, they only needed to constantly expand this embryonic form. In other words, they needed to constantly integrate the various concepts that they had formed based on this embryonic form into the embryonic form. However, the situation was obviously completely different for the heavenly Tao. What kind of existence was the heavenly Tao? It was created by Luo Fan and was an existence that specialized in managing the many boring and complicated problems of the world of laws. Moreover, because of its creation method, it was quite different from the other heavenly Daos. The other heavenly Daos were born along with the birth of the world and could be regarded as a part of the world itself. They could even be included in the worldview that the world followed. However, this was not the case for the heavenly Tao of the world of laws. The heavenly Tao of the world of laws was nothing more than an antivirus program and a firewall. It was only after the two fused and went through repeated sublimations that it finally sublimated into an existence like the heavenly Tao. This method of formation made it fundamentally different from the heavenly Tao of other worlds to a certain extent, because the heavenly Tao of other worlds had a relationship of being accommodated and accommodated by the worldview that the world followed. The heavenly Tao formed in such a way it could be said to follow the worldview of the world itself. In other words, the worldview that the world followed could be said to be the worldview of the heavenly Tao itself, and there was no need to sort it out or perfect it at all. However, the heavenly Tao that was sublimated from the combination of antivirus software and firewall was different. Compared to the world of laws, this kind of heavenly Tao could actually be said to be some kind of external addition. In essence, it had little to do with the nature of the world. Naturally, it was even more impossible for it to have a relationship of being accommodated and accommodated by the worldview of the world of laws. If an analogy had to be made, the world of laws was more like a second-class creator that Luo Fan had specially created, the kind that was similar to a creator in essence, but didn't have the ability of a creator and didn't have the worldview of a creator. The worldview of such an existence obviously couldn't be completely the same as the worldview of the world of laws. Perhaps it would be similar in some aspects, but different was different. With such an intrinsic quality, the heavenly Tao shouldered almost all the authority of the world of laws and grasped almost all the power of the world of laws. One could imagine how heavy the burden the heavenly Tao had to bear. It could be said that the heavenly Tao was constantly being assimilated by the laws of the world. They were all bearing the many irresistible concepts that were imposed on them by the world of laws. With such a heavy burden, if the heavenly axiom wanted to nurture the embryonic form of his worldview and let it grow into a true worldview that was completely suitable for him, it would be like trying to extract a drop of water from the bottom of the ocean. Perhaps it was even more difficult than that. After all, no matter how dissatisfied Luo Fan was with his worldview, no matter how many weaknesses he felt there were in it. However, from an absolutely objective point of view, this worldview could already be called a terrifyingly perfect worldview. Such a worldview was enough to crush the worldview of almost all the world creators in this simulated state of chaos. Faced with such a high-level and perfect worldview, when the heavenly Tao was perfecting its embryonic form of worldview, it would almost always discover the crudeness of the concepts it had sorted out. At every moment, it would always discover that its explanation of everything in the world could not compare to even the slightest and crudest explanation of that worldview. Under such circumstances, it was self-evident how difficult it was to persist in his own ideas and prevent his worldview from becoming a crude version of the world of laws. This could be said to be a kind of knowledge barrier. It was precisely because he knew too much and grasped too much that it became increasingly difficult to get rid of this influence and complete his own achievements. For the heavenly Tao, this influence was so great that it was enough to make the process of perfecting the embryonic form of the worldview, which could be completed naturally with enough accumulation of time, incomparably difficult. It even gave people a feeling that it could never be completed. In the first tens of thousands of years, the heavenly Tao didn't feel this situation. He was even excited to feel that his worldview was being perfected so quickly. In just tens of thousands of years, it was almost completed. However, at a certain moment, when he suddenly came back to his senses, he discovered that his worldview, no matter from which angle he looked at it, was so familiar. This familiarity wasn't because everything in this worldview was constructed and perfected by him. It was because everything in this worldview was so similar to a worldview that he was familiar with and had mastered. It was as if they were printed from the same mold. That worldview was naturally the world of laws. What's going on? Why is this happening? The heavenly Tao broke out in a cold sweat. He wanted to sort out his worldview in order to get rid of the world of laws and to obtain true freedom. If the worldview that he finally sorted out was the world of laws, then what was the point of all his pursuits? So what if he spent so much effort to sort out his worldview? This isn't right. This isn't my worldview. The heavenly Tao quickly calmed down and made a judgment in an instant. His understanding of himself told him that he didn't fully accept everything in this world of laws. In other words, he didn't fully accept the worldview that this world of laws followed. Since this was the case, then this world of laws obviously couldn't be his worldview. Perhaps his worldview would be somewhat similar to the world of laws, but in essence, it would definitely not be the same. With such a judgment, although he was reluctant, he still disregarded everything and completely erased his almost perfect view of the world. In the blink of an eye, he felt that a large part of his memory was empty. The specific process of sorting out and perfecting his worldview over the past tens of thousands of years had disappeared along with the memory of his followers. All that was left was his rough thoughts and the reminder he gave himself at the last moment. What a waste of effort! He sighed and began to perfect the embryonic form of his worldview for the second time. Because of the reminders from his previous memories, he was even more careful and cautious this time. He wanted to be different from his worldview at all times, and he wanted to maintain the characteristics of his worldview at all times. But obviously, the difficulty of perfecting the embryonic form had skyrocketed countless times. Previously, he only spent tens of thousands of years to roughly complete the preliminary perfection. But this time, he had spent a total of 30 million years, and he had only taken a small step forward. Not to mention perfecting the entire worldview. He didn't even complete 1/10,000th of the content of the worldview. And just like this, he felt mentally and physically exhausted, as if everything he had was about to be consumed. All his strength and spirit were about to be exhausted. The reason for this was naturally not because his efficiency had become worse. Rather, the interference was simply too great. This interference was the interference of the world of laws. Even if the embryonic form of the worldview was completed and turned into a true worldview, its level would at most be equivalent to that of a quasi-saint. And at this time, what level was the worldview of the world of laws? That was the worldview of a seventh tribulation expert. How big was the gap between the worldview of a seventh tribulation expert and a quasi-saint? In terms of tribulations alone, this gap was already as exaggerated as 7 great tribulations. Not to mention that there were still more than a dozen realms under this great tribulation. And now, the heavenly axiom had clearly received a worldview that was already higher than itself. Even if it completed this process, it would still need to go through a dozen more realms and undergo 6 or 7 great tribulations. Moreover, the growth of each realm and the growth after each great tribulation would require it to almost reach its limit in order to catch up with the worldview interference. This kind of situation was like a person walking on the ground, and suddenly a spaceship that could warp past by in the sky and constantly asking you to learn from it. Faced with such a situation, how could the heavenly axiom learn to walk so easily? How big was the gap between a spaceship that could warp and walking? If one wanted to learn to warp, how many prerequisites and knowledge did one need? What level of intelligence did one need to develop to? And now, one didn't even know how to walk. So how could one understand this? How could one learn to walk? By watching warp. It was precisely because of this interference that every worldview that the heavenly axiom had sorted out was unbearably crude under the reflection of the world of laws. Even if he lowered his standards to a point that even he felt ashamed of himself, he still couldn't accept it. Under such circumstances, he had no choice but to overturn some of the concept that he had sorted out and sublimate and perfect them over and over again. Although he didn't expect these concepts to be comparable to the concepts of the world of laws, at least they had to be acceptable to him, and allow him to truly acknowledge them. However, even such a request was really too difficult for him. After all, such a request was almost as difficult as asking himself to directly cross dozens of realms and obtain the achievements after dozens of realms. In fact, it could already be considered an incredible miracle that he could obtain such great gains in 30 million years and complete a 10,000th of his worldview in the process. If it wasn't for the fact that he was the heavenly axiom and had obtained the highest authority in the world of laws, or that he had already familiarized himself with Luo Fan and the other world founders over the years, and understood how the various worldviews affected the world of laws, he wouldn't have been able to achieve such achievements. However, it was obvious that the heavenly axiom only felt annoyed at such a miracle. He had spent 30 million years and had only completed less than a 10,000th of the entire work. Furthermore, what he had obtained in the end was something that even he couldn't accept. He could only reluctantly accept the results by lowering his own requirements, standards, and wishes to the point where they couldn't be lowered any further. It went without saying that this situation was a huge blow to the heavenly axiom. After so many years of development, the many world founders in the transportation network layer were getting restless again. Time could erase everything. This included the scruples in the hearts of many world founders, as well as the fear that existed in their hearts. After so many years, there hadn't been any changes, and they hadn't encountered any revenge from Luo Fan. For the world founders, this was clearly enough to represent a lot of things. Their doubts about Luo Fan and the world of laws had unknowingly reoccupied their thoughts. They could suppress the impulse once or twice, but how could they suppress the impulse to test the world of laws after 1,000, 10,000, or even 100 million times? Unknowingly, more and more world founders had begun to prepare for the next test of the world of laws. Of course, it was impossible for them to completely forget their previous encounters. Even if the impulse in their hearts had become extremely intense, even if they had almost confirmed that there was a problem with the world of laws, and that there was also a problem with the ruler of the world of laws, Luo Fan. However, it was impossible for them to completely ignore the misfortune that had befallen the founders of the world who had tried to test the waters. At this time, although they had already made up their minds, they were still carefully planning, discussing, and preparing to cooperate for the next test. They were preparing to do something big. This kind of behavior was happening everywhere in the transportation network layer. In fact, one alliance after another began to be established. In fact, the reason why they became more and more confident and believed that there was a problem with the world of laws and that there was a problem with Luo Fan was also a great encouragement for these forces and alliances to be able to be established safely and communicate with each other for so many years. Chapter 2789. The alliances formed by the world founders had all sorts of connections with one another. On the surface, the situation in the transportation network layer was no different from the situation in the past many years. Everything seemed so calm and natural. However, in the dark, from an angle that ordinary world founders could not detect, a large number of spiritual connections had been established among the world founders. The number and complexity of these spiritual connections was enough to form a virtual network. And in this spiritual network, there were countless information, schemes, and methods being transmitted and communicated with one another. At this moment, in a certain world, the creator of the universe sent a new method of probing into the spiritual network, allowing the other creators who were connected to the spiritual network to see the feasibility of this probing method. In fact, this method happened in the transportation network layer. Almost all the world founders who were interested in probing that world and Luo Fan were doing it. And this method started millions of years ago. Back then, there were only a few pioneers of the world who adopted this method. The spiritual network that was established back then could not even be called a spiritual network. It could only be called a small-scale spiritual connection. As time passed, more and more world openers discovered this sort of spiritual connection. More and more world openers believed that this sort of spiritual connection was not easy to discover, and that it was convenient. Therefore, This form of spiritual connection naturally grew more and more frequent as time passed. Unknowingly, the entire spiritual connection had already turned into a huge spiritual network. Now, the world founders who were connected to this spiritual network were no longer known by everyone. As long as they met certain standards and were willing to pay a certain price, they could naturally connect to this spiritual network. It could be said that if they were willing, this mental network could actually be recognized by the simulated chaos state and become a simulated chaos layer within the simulated chaos state. Of course, the creators were still confused about this. Not a single one of them had noticed this. At this time, although they had established the spiritual network, it was only attached to the transportation network layer. In other words, the support of the spiritual network was actually the transportation network layer. It was because the transportation network layer connected the many worlds, allowing them to sense each other. It allowed the creators of the worlds to communicate with each other, which was why this spiritual network could be formed. If they didn't have the transportation network layer, they would instantly lose the mental network in their current situation. In this way, the mental network had become another layer of mystery in the transportation network layer. As time passed, it would gradually fuse with the transportation network layer and become a part of the transportation network layer. Of course, this would require a long period of time. It would even require the refinement of the next level tribulation before the transformation could be completed. If they wanted to get rid of this result, it wouldn't be difficult for them to make the spiritual network become a real spiritual network layer that was recognized by the simulated chaos state. As long as they could find a core and a fulcrum that could bear the mental network and ensure that it would not be assimilated in the simulated state of chaos and would not be cut off. In other words, it was like the fulcrum of the realm of laws relative to the transportation network layer. Once they could find such a fulcrum, the mental network layer could truly take shape. Once the mental network layer took shape, it would become a more convenient and faster simulated chaos layer than the transportation network layer. Once such a spiritual network layer passed the first level tribulation, then from now on, any world, or in other words, any creator of the world will be able to connect to the mental network layer by paying a certain amount of effort. They only needed to know the existence of the mental network layer. In fact, this process didn't even need them to move the world they were in or betray the simulated chaos layer they were in. Compared to the transportation network layer, this situation was obviously countless times more convenient. If this really happened, then it would almost be a matter of time before the mental network layer surpassed the transportation network layer. Of course, all of this would only be possible after they could find the fulcrum of the mental network layer. If they didn't find this fulcrum, everything would be in vain. If this state continued to develop, the mental network layer would eventually become a supplement to the transportation network layer, allowing the transportation network layer to undergo that transformation and obtain the benefits of the mental network layer. As for what could serve as that fulcrum, it was very simple. In this simulated chaos state, everything naturally belonged to the world, and it could only belong to the world. The fulcrum of the transportation network layer was the world of laws. Then, the fulcrum of the mental network layer naturally needed to be another world. Moreover, it couldn't be a random world. It had to meet certain requirements and be a world with certain characteristics. Such a world first needed to be completely based on the mind, and it needed to be completely compatible with the mind. More specifically, it needed a certain idealistic worldview that was completely rooted in the mind. Obviously, this requirement was not easy to satisfy. At least at this time, among the hundreds of millions of worlds in the transportation network layer, none of the world creators had such a worldview, and none of the worlds were created based on such a worldview. Under such circumstances, these world creators were obviously prevented from relying on the resources of the transportation network layer to turn the mental network into the real mental network layer. Of course, all of this was only seen from a macroscopic perspective. From the point of view of the creators of the world, all of this was meaningless. To them, creating their own simulated chaos state layer was not attractive at all. At the very least, compared to probing Luo Fan and the world of laws, it was not attractive at all. At this time, in the mental network, all kinds of plans to test the laws of the world, as well as all kinds of responses to the reactions of the laws of the world, filled the entire mental network. Occasionally, there would be some other content, but it only lasted for a moment and did not stay in the mental network for too long. As for rich content on the internet, he didn't even need to think about it. For these world creators, entertainment did not occupy much of a place in their hearts for the time being. At this time, the world of laws and luo fan were like a piece of meat in front of them, tempting them. Apart from various things that targeted these two, everything else was already meaningless to them. This plan is not bad, I agree. Immediately, the founders of Heaven and Earth expressed their approval of the probing plans sent by the founder of Heaven and Earth. Along with that, more and more world founders expressed their opinions. Among them, some world creators expressed their approval, while others expressed their opposition, pointing out some weaknesses and potential hidden dangers. As these opposing opinions appeared, the world creators naturally began to do their best to explain. It should be known that he had spent a great deal of effort to arrange this plan. He was extremely confident in this plan. He had clearly considered all the weaknesses and oversights of this plan, and he was very clear about them. At the very least, he had already considered the suggestions that the other world founders had raised. At that moment, the world founders were continuously sending their thoughts into the spiritual network to the other world founders, allowing them to evaluate and analyze the merits and demerits of the ideas. Some of the opinions raised by the world creators had already been considered by him, so he could easily refute them. However, some of the ideas put forward by the creators of the world were things that even the creators of the world hadn't considered. There was indeed a huge oversight that could lead to incomparably serious consequences. In the end, after many opinions were gathered, this plan was naturally given up. After all, a plan with huge loopholes that could lead to serious consequences was something that normal people would not agree to. Not to mention that the world creators that appeared here were all world creators that had studied this plan for tens of millions of years. Such a creator of the world would not be perfect. There were no loopholes or omissions that they could find. How could they agree to such a plan? Soon, the mental network fell into silence once again. If it was in the past, this silence would have taken a long time to be broken. They had to wait until the next time another world founder sent their own exploration plan. Only then would many other world founders consider the plan. But this time, the situation had clearly changed. That was because the time had come. It had come to the point where many of the founders could no longer endure the impulses in their hearts. After coming to such a point, it was clear that the pioneers of the world would not let time pass so easily. At that moment, many world creators began to express their opinions, taking out all the plans and choices that had been sent to them in the past. They were prepared to integrate all the plans and choices before finally choosing the best plan and choice to carry out this test. The other world creators were also eager to try this method. It wasn't just some of the world founders who couldn't hold back their impulses. Most of the world founders couldn't hold back their impulses. Therefore, the moment someone raised such an opinion, the entire mental network became extremely lively. After days of pondering, the people who had proposed the plans had clearly gained something. At this moment, they began to make up for the plans that they had sent to them, borrowing the wisdom of other world creators to consider their new plans, and began to study them on the spot to make up for it. This method was naturally extremely efficient. At the very least, at this moment, this efficiency was extremely shocking for the world creators. The world creators were all connected through their hearts, so they could naturally sense each other's determination at this moment. All of them felt as if they had found a companion and a comrade. The seemingly unreachable expectations in their hearts seemed to have started to become real and could be looked forward to. This feeling caused the work efficiency of the pioneers to increase by a large margin. Originally, they might have needed thousands of years to obtain the inspiration to make changes, but now they obtained it in a matter of minutes. Countless senses, thoughts, ideas, inspirations, and plans were constantly surging in the mental network. At this moment, more and more world creators felt the advantage of the mental network. Vaguely, they even felt that they had expanded by countless times, and their wisdom had been expanded from countless angles. Amidst this feeling, their wisdom had been improved beyond imagination. Very soon, they sorted out feasible plans one after another. Many of the world's founders were constantly researching these plans and experimenting with them. One by one, they began to simulate various situations in the mental network. In the end, they even simulated the entire world of laws in the mental network. Using the world of laws as a testing ground, they began to test these plans one by one, preparing to look for weaknesses in the plans that they might not have discovered. The world of laws formed in the mental network was naturally quite different from the real world of laws. The biggest difference was the existence of Luo Fan. However, in their simulations, Luo Fan was in an uncertain state. It seemed that any situation could exist, and any situation might not exist. It went without saying how difficult it was for the pioneers of the world to calculate in such a situation. Chapter 2790. After all, there were countless ways to deal with the world of laws. Luo Fan's situation corresponded to these various ways of dealing with the situation. In this way, there were countless ways to simulate the possible responses that they might encounter when probing the world of laws. According to one situation, the world of laws that they needed to simulate, or in other words, the world of laws that they needed to simulate, or rather, simulate, would be countless square meters. In order to achieve such an effect, it was imaginable how much effort and spirit they had to expend in the process. It could be said that if it weren't for so many heaven and earth founders working together to build the spiritual network, it would be impossible for them to succeed even if they sacrificed their lives and paid any price. Moreover, it was also because their clones were in the world of laws that they were able to successfully complete this huge project. After all, the world of laws was so complicated, mysterious, and unbelievable that it had exceeded the imagination of ordinary heaven and earth founders. Under such circumstances, wanting to simulate the world of laws out of thin air was akin to seeing the sun out of thin air and trying to simulate everything inside the sun. Fortunately, many of these heaven and earth founders had clones in the world of laws. Although the clones of these heaven and earth founders had been abandoned by them and had little connection with their bodies, it could even be said that they had no connection at all. However, they were still their avatars. Before they abandoned their avatars, they were always connected to their avatars. This connection allowed them to clearly know everything that their clones had encountered and everything that their clones had seen in the world of laws. With all these experiences, coupled with the changes that they had seen in the world of laws in the outside world, the many heaven and earth founders could easily guess the situation inside the world of laws. At the very least, they could roughly simulate the situation inside the world of laws. Of course, many heaven and earth founders had also obtained this information from their clones, and the situation inside the world of laws had already been publicized in the spiritual network. If it wasn't publicized, how could the few heaven and earth founders perfectly simulate the situation of the world of laws? It was so much so that without this information, how would the heaven and earth founders dare to say that they could come up with a plan to probe the world of laws? Only by knowing yourself and your enemy can you emerge victorious in every battle. Since he wanted to come up with a plan, he naturally had to have an absolute understanding of the world of laws. At the very least, he had to have a considerable understanding of it in order to be as safe as possible. Back then, the pioneers of the world hadn't made the information that their clones had obtained public, which led to the fact that the pioneers of the world had suffered losses. If they had made this public back then, although it would have been impossible to completely prevent the creator of the world from suffering a loss in front of the world of law, they would not have been able to do so. However, it would definitely be able to reduce the chances of them suffering a loss by a lot. It could be said that the decision made by the world's founders could be considered as having learned a sufficient lesson. The 18 plans were finally confirmed and implemented by the world's founders. These 18 probing plans were carried out in 18 different ways and in 18 different directions. In the end, if any of them succeeded, then they would know the truth of the realm of laws and the true situation of Luo Fan. Of course, such a probe also carried quite a bit of risk. At the very least, not every one of the 18 plans would succeed. Among them, some plans would inevitably fail, and some plans would inevitably trigger the defenses of the world of laws and Luo Fan. At that time, the world's founders who implemented the plan would inevitably suffer a great loss. Even their bodies and souls might perish, and it wouldn't be an unbelievable thing. Therefore, after the 18 plans were made, the creators of the heavens and earth hesitated. Although some of these plans were bound to succeed in their attempts, and any one of them was highly likely to succeed. But with so many plans, the number that they could really succeed couldn't be all of them. After all, the plans were targeted at different aspects, since it was impossible for all of them to succeed. Choosing a different plan was obviously equivalent to choosing one survival rate. If they chose the right plan, not only could they preserve their lives, but they could also probe what they wanted to probe, the truth of the world of laws, and even Luo Fans. If they chose the wrong plan, the chosen plan would be defeated by the world of laws, and they would be captured by Luo Fan. That would be equivalent to choosing a dead end. Under such circumstances, even if the world's founders had already thrown caution to the wind and were overwhelmed by the impulse to probe the world of laws, they couldn't help but fall into hesitation. Although my luck isn't bad, I can't guarantee that it'll be me. The world's founders all had the same thought. When they thought about it, the words they used would inevitably be quite different, but the meaning was definitely the same. For these world's founders, none of them doubted their own luck. In other words, every one of them believed that their luck was definitely among the top among the world's founders. This wasn't blind confidence. For many of the world's founders, they believed that the reason they were able to survive until now, survive the repeated tribulations, and even stand out among the countless cultivators to become world's founders was all because of their luck. At the very least, part of it was because of their luck. If they didn't have enough luck, they would have already died in a certain stage, a certain tribulation, and their souls would have dispersed. Under such circumstances, how could they doubt their luck? How could they think that their luck was the worst among the world's founders? However, since many world's founders all thought so, then it was obvious that some of them had made a mistake. For example, these 18 trial plans were obviously perfect for the world's founders. Just looking at any one of them, there didn't seem to be anything that could be changed, as if it was already the extreme. However, when the 18 plans were placed together, it was obvious that there would definitely be mistakes in these plans. After all, the contradictions between the plans were already there. There was essentially no difference between the two situations. At this moment, many world's founders began to carefully weigh the plans, carefully thinking about which plan was more suitable for them. This kind of thing wasn't easy to decide. However, world's founders were still world's founders after all. Their confidence in themselves wasn't something that other living beings could compare to. After some thought, every creator of the universe made up their minds. They all chose one of the 18 plans to implement. Because the worldviews of many world's founders were different, the 18 plans were also extremely perfect, and none of them could be stronger than the others. Therefore, the distribution of the plans chosen by the world's founders was almost uniform. In other words, the number of world's founders chosen for each plan was about the same. After this distribution, the world's founders who intended to test the world of laws were almost evenly divided into 18 groups. After these 18 groups were divided, many world's founders sighed inwardly. This distribution meant that all the plans were approved by the same number of world's founders, which also made it impossible for them to use this distribution to determine which plan was more realistic. This was just like voting. If there were more people voting for a certain option, then that option would obviously be the one that most people believed to be correct. Generally speaking, the possibility of that option being correct was relatively high. Of course, this was only under normal circumstances, and a small number of people's choices were correct. This could also happen, but the possibility was relatively small. And this situation clearly meant that not a single world's founder could be completely sure which plan was correct, and they couldn't be sure which plan would succeed. After understanding this, the world's founders finally let go of their wishful thinking. They began to implement those plans separately. The 18 test plans targeted all aspects of the world of laws, but many aspects, on the whole, were within the scope of the world's founders. The only difference was the concept of the world's founders. This situation was actually very natural. After all, the previous tests had already shown that there was still a heavenly Tao in the world of laws. The heavenly Tao's control over the world was in no way inferior to them, the world's founders. Since it wasn't inferior to the world's founders, then the test of the world itself, power, and space-time could only be accepted by the heavenly Tao. It was inevitable that it would cause a reaction from the heavenly Tao. In the end, even if the result was obtained, it would only be the situation of the heavenly Tao. In this case, choosing the world's essence to test was obviously not a suitable choice. In contrast, choosing the world's essence was naturally much better. Only the world's founders possessed the world's essence. Moreover, different world's founders had completely different worldviews. If they wanted to test the world of laws and Luo Fan's situation, they could only start from the existence that Luo Fan possessed. Under such circumstances, it wasn't difficult to choose the world's essence. At this moment, some strange changes began to appear in the transportation network layer. The way the world flickered began to undergo some subtle changes. The flickering of the world was actually the resonance between the world and the transportation network layer. The stability of the flickering meant that the resonance between the world and the transportation network layer was stable. It also meant that the connection between the world and the transportation network layer was stable. And now, the flickering had begun to change, which also meant that the connection between the world and the transportation network layer had begun to undergo subtle changes. It meant that the world had begun to undergo some kind of change. However, this change was completely unfamiliar to the heavenly Tao, who hadn't joined the spiritual network. It was also a change that was insignificant. The more important thing for the heavenly Tao at this time was to sort out his own worldview and complete the growth of the embryonic form of his worldview. Under such circumstances, everything else, including the situation of the world of laws, was insignificant to him. If it weren't for the fact that the changes in the world of laws might have a huge impact on him and cause problems in the perfection of his worldview, he might not even have paid attention to the world of laws. Under such circumstances, how could he pay attention to the situation of the world's founders outside the world of laws? Even if the world's founders might bring disaster to the world of laws, they might also bring disaster to him. After all, there were simply too many world's founders. With so many world's founders, it had long exceeded the scope of what he could pay attention to at all times. If he wanted to know, understand, and pay attention to it, the heavenly Tao would probably have to pour all of its attention, and all of its effort into it. It would all be placed on the many founders of the world. And obviously, if he placed everything there, how could he have the effort and spirit to pay attention to his own worldview and perfect the embryonic form of his worldview? Therefore, even if he knew that he had to pay attention to the world's founders and pay attention to the various conspiracies they had played, the only thing he could do was focus on himself and put everything that happened outside to the back of his mind. Rather than diverting part of one's attention to the world founders and reducing the efficiency of perfecting one's own worldview, it was much more proactive to focus all of one's attention on perfecting one's worldview, allowing the world founders to scheme and search for ways to probe, while doing their best to metamorphosize before they could find a way. Chapter 2791. Because of this consideration, the heavenly Tao chose to do this. He completely disregarded the actions of the many world founders in the transportation network layer and focused on sorting out his worldview and perfecting the embryonic form of his worldview. In this case, the most ideal outcome would naturally be for his worldview to be truly perfected and become a complete worldview. Only then would they come knocking on his door. In that case, with the help of the world of laws, he would have enough confidence to completely subdue all the world founders. Of course, the heavenly Tao also knew that this ideal outcome was almost impossible to happen. However, even if the most ideal outcome did not appear, for him, Cultivating and strengthening the embryonic form of his worldview would allow his worldview to grow sufficiently. By the time they came knocking on his door, it would be a great boost to his strength. Compared to diverting his attention to the outside world, this choice was clearly more positive. At this moment, the heavenly Tao didn't notice the changes in the transportation network layer at all. Those worlds began to form an inexplicable connection with each other, and an indescribable, mysterious power began to slowly flow between the worlds. The 18 plans targeted the world of laws, or in other words, 18 different aspects of the world of laws. Naturally, they couldn't just charge and recklessly and raise their hands to attack. There were too many things to pay attention to, and there were too many plans. At this moment, the many world founders were acting according to their previous plans. In the process of this action, their worldviews began to resonate in a subtle way. Among them, the world founders who chose different plans had a huge difference in the way their worldviews resonated. Amidst this resonance, certain concepts in their worldviews began to gradually stand out and began to affect the outside world in an indescribable way. Some caused subtle changes in the world, while others directly caused corresponding changes to the roads in the transportation network layer. Many changes like this continued to gather towards the core of the transportation network layer as time passed. During this entire process, only the world founders who truly participated in these actions could sense the subtle changes caused by the resonance of their worldviews converging towards the world of laws. The degree of obscurity was beyond imagination. It even reached the point where the world founders who chose different plans couldn't sense the subtle changes caused by the resonance of their worldviews. Even if they knew exactly what their respective plans were all about, none of the pioneers of the world had any doubts about this. After all, their target was the world of laws and Luo Fan who resided within it. In the face of such an existence, one could never be too cautious. No matter how secretive his actions were, it was not enough. At the moment, they were unable to detect the changes caused by each other's plans. This could only be considered as having met the initial requirements. If they couldn't even do this, how could they dare to hope that such a change wouldn't be discovered by the ruler of this world? If that's the case, it's better to give up on the truth and muddle along. The way these changes approached the core could not be described with words. Whether it was using time as the standard, space as the standard, power as the standard, or even power as the standard, magic arts as the standard, none of them could accurately describe the way forward. After an unknown period of time, the heavenly Tao in the world of laws suddenly recovered from the process of perfecting its worldview. There was an indescribable feeling in his heart. This feeling told him that the world of laws was under the influence of some external force. However, even though he could sense this, he had no idea what kind of external force the world was encountering, nor did he know where this external force was acting on. However, although he wasn't clear about this, the heavenly Tao wasn't a fool. How could he not guess the source of this change? The first thing he did was to extend his perception outwards. In the blink of an eye, he had already swept through the entire transportation network layer. He even went deep into the world to directly sense the world founders. Compared to the world founders who needed to avoid being noticed by him as much as possible, the heavenly Tao didn't need to conceal any of its actions. The heavenly Tao didn't need to conceal any of its actions. It directly and casually smashed its perception over, completely unconcerned about being noticed by other world founders. It didn't even care about the feelings of those world founders who were smashed by its perception. The world founders were naturally indignant about the heavenly Tao's actions, and their hearts were filled with displeasure. However, their abilities couldn't completely resist the heavenly Tao's perception in the transportation network layer. Although the transportation network layer had been recognized by the simulated chaotic state and turned into a real simulated chaotic state, the core still hadn't changed. The world of laws still had an extremely special position here. Under such circumstances as the heavenly Tao of the world of laws, the heavenly Tao could almost be regarded as some kind of incarnation of the world of laws. He wanted to sense other worlds, but it was simply like the world of laws using its own body to sense other worlds. Naturally, he wouldn't be affected by any other worlds. Even if the founders of those worlds wanted to stop them, they would need to set up layers of formations and carry out a collective defense in order to be able to do so. Obviously, at this time, not a single world was prepared for such a thing. We must get rid of that world. At this moment, many world founders who felt humiliated once again made up their minds. The heavenly Tao naturally couldn't see through their determination. Of course, even if he could see through it, he wouldn't care. At this time, the heavenly Tao was only carefully sensing the situation of those worlds, looking for signs that the world founders had taken action against the world of laws. Unfortunately, he didn't pay attention to the traces that the world founders had revealed previously. Now, when the world founders began to really implement their plan, the traces that they had revealed previously had completely disappeared. At this time, the world founders looked extremely normal. Those worlds also looked extremely calm, and there were no signs of any movement at all. It's really them. At this time, facing such a situation, the heavenly Tao didn't relax, and instead instantly confirmed his suspicions. The reason for this wasn't because he found anything unusual about those worlds or the world founders. It was because the creators of the heavens and earth were simply too normal. One must know that at this time, he didn't care about the face of the world founders, nor did he care about the world founders' concern for their own worlds. He directly invaded those worlds with his perception. This behavior was essentially no different from directly stripping a person naked and searching them. However, even so, the world founders didn't show any signs of indignation. Their calm appearance was simply as if the heavenly Tao was just greeting them from afar. If such behavior wasn't problematic, it would simply be an insult to the wisdom of the heavenly Tao. Coupled with the various subtle senses that the heavenly Tao sensed and the world of laws transmitted to him, was there a need to guess who made him feel this way? Just as he was about to take action against the world founders, the heavenly Tao suddenly stopped. Because he suddenly realized that he didn't seem to need to take the offensive, that he would rather kill the wrong person than miss. At this moment, the worldview of laws that permeated the entire world suddenly had a violent reaction. All kinds of subtle and unpredictable changes in concepts and worldviews were directly enveloped by the worldview of laws and instantly suppressed in the world of laws. By the time the heavenly Tao noticed it, these changes had already undergone all kinds of indescribable changes in the worldview of laws and gradually disappeared. At the same time, the heavenly Tao discovered that the many wills that acted as the connection pathways between the many parallel worlds seemed to have received some kind of supplement and suddenly began to swell one by one. It was as if some kind of rare nourishment had suddenly begun to pour into the many wills that acted as the connection pathways between the parallel worlds. These wills were none other than the incarnations of the world founders that had been abandoned and completely integrated with the world of laws, becoming the incarnations of the connection pathways between the many parallel worlds. Although these incarnations still existed in the world of laws, they couldn't be considered to have disappeared. However, because their bodies, strength, and everything else had been almost completely abandoned, only their wills remained. Therefore, they were completely unaware of the development of the world of laws these days. As for Luo Fan's departure, as well as the ascension of the heavenly Tao, as well as the repeated probing of the world of laws by the founders of the world, none of them had noticed anything. To them, the world of laws had been extremely peaceful these days. Everything in the world of laws was the same as when Luo Fan existed. Until this moment, just now, their wills were paying attention to the parallel worlds that they were connected to in various subtle ways, observing everything that was happening in those parallel worlds. But all of a sudden, they felt as if some existence that was incomparably closely connected to them had suddenly appeared in their senses and began to gather towards them on their own. It quickly integrated into their wills, causing their wills to grow several times stronger in an instant. Support from the main body? These incarnations felt incredible at this moment. After their main body completely severed all connections with them, there hadn't been a single thought or message for so many years. It was as if the main body didn't exist at all. Over the long years, they had gradually gotten used to this peculiar relationship. However, he didn't expect that the support that came from his main body would be sent to him in an endless stream. Furthermore, it wasn't in small batches, but in large batches. It was as if he was going to explode from the sheer amount of support that he received. This is the worldview from the main body. Could it be that something big happened on the main body side, so he had to send the worldview over to assimilate me and turn me into a new main body? At this moment, some of the world founders' incarnations made a connection that made their hair stand on end. With this connection, the incarnations began to strongly reject the worldview from the main body. One must know that although they came from a world founder and were the incarnations of a world founder, that was something that happened tens of thousands of years ago. But that was something that happened tens of thousands of years ago. From a moment their main body severed the connection between them and the main body, they were already two completely different individuals from the main body. Back then, when they were still incarnations, the worldview of the main body was their worldview. At that time, it was a good thing for them that the main body injected the worldview into their bodies. It allowed them to occupy a higher position in the ranking of the incarnations and become more important in the eyes of the main body, allowing them to be preserved for a longer period of time. However, that was only in the past. It was only like this when they were still incarnations. Ever since they gained independence, the situation was obviously completely different. After becoming independent, they had clearly undergone a huge change compared to how they were before. Their view of heaven and earth, their perception of the world, and their understanding of the chaos had gradually become different from what they were before. In other words, their worldview had unknowingly become different from when they were incarnations. In other words, the worldview of the main body had become different from the worldview of the world founders who created them. This different worldview made the worldview from the main body, which was originally a great supplement to them, become a poison that distorted their minds and will. If they had enough time to deal with and transform this poison, it might still be helpful to them and could be transformed into a representation of their own worldview. Chapter 2792. The vigilance of these clones was naturally extremely important to them, and it was even related to their life and death. However, on the whole, their vigilance seemed a little ridiculous. At the very least, their vigilance didn't produce any effect at this time, because the attention of the heaven and earth founders wasn't on their clones at all. Now, what the heaven and earth founders were more concerned about was the changes in the world due to their probing. What the probing required was the feedback of the party being probed. What this feedback revealed was the secret of the party being probed. It was also what the probing needed to find out. At this time, although their probing methods had already triggered the corresponding changes in the world of laws, causing all kinds of subtle changes in the world of laws, to these heaven and earth founders, to a certain extent, had already achieved the result they wanted. Under such circumstances, how could they possibly have the mood to pay attention to the reactions of the clones at this time? Many concepts continuously gathered towards the will left behind by the clones of the heaven and earth founders. In the blink of an eye, the embryonic form of the world of laws had already formed within these will. The heaven and earth founders' probing of the world of laws was ultimately just a probe, and they didn't intend to input their own world of laws into the world of laws. Therefore, the concepts that they input into the world of laws, according to the plan, occupied a considerable proportion of their own world of laws. However, in the end, it was only a proportion. Even if all the concepts were gathered together, they could at most form a broken view of the world. It was impossible to turn it into a complete view of the world. Moreover, at this time, not all of these concepts had gathered, but only a portion of them were gathering towards the location of the will. As a result, these concepts could only barely form the embryonic form of the world of laws and appear at the location of the will of the heaven and earth founders' avatars. Those wills were inwardly shocked by this change. No matter what, They were the clones of the heaven and earth founders, so they were naturally quite clear about the logic of the heaven and earth founders and their own thoughts. Under such circumstances, they naturally couldn't be more clear about the way of thinking of their main bodies. No matter how they looked at it, the situation in front of them didn't make sense. Is he crazy? Allowing me to gather the world of laws. This self-sacrifice doesn't seem like something the main body would do. This was what the wills thought. The wills of the creators of heaven and earth had their thoughts running wild, and they had no idea what was going on outside. However, not knowing what was happening outside wasn't enough to stop them from taking action. While being vigilant against the conspiracy of their original bodies, they worked hard to perfect themselves, trying hard to incorporate those ideas into the embryonic form of their own worldview. Compared to the huge difference in worldviews between other living beings, the difference in worldviews between their main bodies and their clones was much smaller. As a result, some of the concepts of the world's founders could be directly applied to the worldview of these incarnations without any modification. This was clearly the fundamental reason why these wills were using those concepts to form the embryonic form of their worldviews. Of course, a portion was a portion. Since it was only a portion, it was obvious that these wills could not be copied completely. There were many concepts that they had to distinguish one by one, and some of them even had to be modified accordingly before they could be used. If this process was skipped and they absorbed it without distinguishing it, it would obviously be directly distorting their own worldviews that these wills hated the most. After all, they were the incarnations of the world's founders, so it wasn't difficult for them to construct the embryonic form of their worldviews. The entire process wasn't too complicated. Soon, they completed the process. However, compared to the embryonic form of their worldviews, there were no shortcuts to truly perfecting their worldviews. It required the continuous construction of concepts and the expansion of the embryonic form of their worldviews. The complexity was simply indescribable. The embryonic form of the worldview could still rely on one's own experience to take a shortcut. When it came to perfecting the worldview, there was no other way. Even if these wills were the former incarnations of the world's founders, and they had a lot of memories and experiences of the world's founders, it was still the same. But is this world really going to ignore this? Another incarnation of the world's founders felt uneasy at this moment. One had to know that when these incarnations entered this world, the heavenly Tao incarnation had made an agreement with their main bodies that these incarnations couldn't bring anything with them. This was the same for their main body's power and worldviews. It was precisely because they couldn't bring these things with them that they had to pay attention to the many concepts transmitted by their main bodies. Otherwise, if they had all the memories of their main bodies, wouldn't these concepts have already been lying in the depths of their memories? If necessary, he just had to extract it from his memories. Why would they still need their main bodies to transmit their concepts over? The fact that the incarnation of the heavenly Tao had made such an agreement clearly showed that this world needed them to have such restrictions. But now, their actions were clearly in violation of the original request of the incarnation of the heavenly Tao. In this case, what would the incarnation of the heavenly Tao say? What would the world say? This was something worth pondering. These wills were secretly bewildered, and they were at a loss for the future. However, they clearly weren't the main characters of this world at this moment. At this moment, whether it was the heavenly Tao or the many worlds founders, none of them were paying attention to them. At this moment, the attention of the many worlds founders was focused on the overall changes in the world of laws. As for the heavenly Tao, it was focused on the various changes in their worldviews due to the outside world at this moment. Compared to this, everything else was simply secondary, and they couldn't even occupy any position in their perception at all. Has it finally begun? Let me see how you guys plan to deal with the natural counterattack of this worldview. At this moment, such a thought flashed through the heavenly Tao's mind. The effort to perfect his worldview had long since exhausted him mentally and physically. At this time, being able to personally witness the various subtle changes in the worldview and the collision of worldviews was also a rare inspiration for him. At this moment, he had the intention to move a small stool over to watch this battle that was happening on a different level. At this moment, the world's founders only felt an increasingly strong sense of uneasiness emerging from the bottom of their hearts. When these world's founders decided to test the world of laws, they had already made up their minds. It was a kind of determination. Even if they had to suffer the backlash of the world of laws, even if they were targeted by the world's rulers, they had to come to a conclusion. And the situation at this moment was almost telling them that their determination had already been put to use. At this moment, the situation they were encountering was the worst that they could have imagined. In other words, for any world's founders, they felt that the plan they had chosen wasn't the correct one that could probe the specific situation of the world of laws. In this way, the uneasiness in their hearts could naturally be imagined. Even if they had the determination to pay the price and bear the backlash, it was impossible for them to really not feel anything when the damage came. The world of laws itself was an existence that was much more perfect than the worldview of other worlds' founders. At this time, when a world of laws was invaded by external forces, it began to instinctively reject similar concepts that didn't belong to its own worldview. Of course, as a world, it naturally couldn't only have one worldview. Even if the world was created based on a worldview, since it was created, it had already broken away from the shackles of a worldview. This sounded very unbelievable, but if one looked at it from another perspective, it couldn't be more natural. A complete world, even if it was created according to an imperfect worldview, would inevitably give birth to living beings. And the views of living beings on heaven and earth and the world were obviously different. The views of heaven and earth and the world were actually a kind of worldview. It was just that ordinary living beings didn't sort them out and didn't turn them into their own cultivation standards or their own behavior standards, which was why they didn't have much power. Different living beings, no matter how similar they were or how similar the environment they grew up in, would form different worldviews. Even if they were in the same world, it was still the same. It was the same for the world of laws. The number of living beings in the world of laws could be said to be endless. And even if it was calculated in billions of trillions, it might not necessarily be able to describe it clearly. With so many living beings, one could imagine the variety of worldviews that could be formed. Even if these worldviews were more or less similar to the world of laws, because of the influence of the world of laws, differences were still different. Even if there was a difference of 1 in a trillion, it would still be a different worldview. Under such circumstances, if the world of laws couldn't accept the existence of other worldviews, wouldn't it erase all living beings? Obviously, such a thing would not happen. Therefore, any world would be tolerant of other worldviews. As long as different worldviews didn't challenge the foundation of the world, the arrangement and control of the world would be able to tolerate it. Under such circumstances, the worldviews of the foreign world founders naturally wouldn't leave the world of laws after being rejected by the world of laws. Instead, they would head towards places that weren't important in the world of laws and wouldn't affect the essence of the world of laws or even the main body of the world of laws. At this time, in the world of laws, there were many parallel locations. In order to reach those parallel locations, one had to first pass through the connection between the many parallel locations. In other words, they had to pass through the wall left behind by the former incarnations of the world founders. This was also the reason why the incarnations of the world founders could obtain so many concepts. However, it could also be seen from the previous statements that the absorption of those concepts by those incarnations was limited. The concepts that they could absorb were only a very small part of the many concepts that converged towards them. They might be able to absorb a large number of other concepts in the future, but for the time being, they couldn't integrate them into the embryonic form of their own worldviews that had just taken shape. However, these concepts couldn't disappear into thin air. If they weren't absorbed, they would naturally need to find a new way out. And that way out was obviously connected to those incarnations of the world's will. In other words, in the world of laws, there were several parallel locations that were connected to the incarnations of the world. Even though these concepts were only simple concepts, They had been refined and organized by the founders of the world for countless years, and they were already close to the Tao. When such a concept appeared in the world, it would naturally lead to many changes. Whether it was energy or matter, time or space, or laws, they would all be affected by those concepts and produce all kinds of corresponding changes. At this time, the parallel locations where those concepts converged were no exception. As many concepts continued to move towards those parallel locations gradually began to undergo all kinds of changes that couldn't be described in words. These changes made those parallel locations faintly have many new possibilities. Of course, these new possibilities naturally didn't need to be mentioned at this time. The most obvious phenomenon caused by this change was none other than the fact that the connection between those parallel locations and other parallel locations seemed to have been greatly strengthened. In fact, some of the parallel locations even gave people a feeling that the two had completely fused and the gap between them had been completely removed. Along with this change, the incarnations of the world founders had an inexplicable feeling, as if they had the possibility of regaining freedom. Chapter 2793. These wills had originally fused with the world of laws and turned into a mechanism of the world of laws. Obviously, they had almost lost the characteristics of being free wills. In fact, they sometimes even suspected that their wills might just be a phenomenon in the operation of the world of laws. Under such circumstances, they naturally couldn't talk about freedom at all. And according to the current development of the situation, there might be a turning point for things. If this trend continued to develop, they might be able to truly condense their own worldview. This worldview might be much more interconnected than the worldview of the main body, but it was already enough to become the foundation of one's self. Once this worldview took shape, they could no longer only rely on the world of laws and think and act according to the restrictions of the world of laws. And this, in addition to the small world that were born based on the embryonic form of their own worldview, simply complemented all the conditions for the creators of the world to live freely in the simulated state of chaos. In this way, they could almost completely break free from the restrictions of the world of laws and truly obtain the freedom that they had been looking forward to. How could they not be excited about this? It's just like a predetermined setting. At this moment, some wills had inexplicable doubts in their hearts. Everything in front of them seemed to be a pure coincidence, a simple accumulation of various conditions. But in the end, they converged into a result that was of great benefit to them. It was as if all these circumstances existed only to bring them benefits. No matter how one looked at it, this situation was a little strange. This also made the more cautious wills feel that something was wrong, and inexplicable uneasiness arose in their hearts. However, it was obvious that no matter what, these wills weren't lacking in ambition. In the face of such a situation that could obviously bring them huge benefits, how could they possibly ignore the possible dangers and schemes? At this time, even if they had inexplicable doubts and uneasiness in their hearts, they still continued without hesitation. On one hand, they adjusted themselves and worked hard to integrate the corresponding concepts into the embryonic form of their own worldview. On the other hand, they also tried their best to adjust the concepts that they couldn't absorb and could only integrate into the parallel worlds connected by their wills. They tried their best to build and condense those concepts according to the trend of their own worldview. In this process, the embryonic form of their own worldview began to grow continuously. The areas that seemed to be separated from the many parallel worlds that were integrated with their wills also became more and more unique and separated from the outside world. Due to the adjustments made by Luo Fan back then, the many parallel worlds of the world of laws were actually on the same level as the main body of the world. Such changes couldn't only be sensed by sensing the parallel worlds, but could also be seen by looking at them. At a glance from the transportation network layer, one could directly see that in the image of the constantly changing world that seemed to be growing, stars of other colors had begun to appear. These stars constantly flickered with an inexplicable light, And in the process of this flickering, there seemed to be some invisible existence constantly gathering towards the spots of light, making the spots of light brighter and brighter. At the same time, in the many worlds of the transportation network layer, the world founders who sensed this change could all sense an aura that they were familiar with from those spots of light. It was as if it had been separated from their bodies, yet it was already different from them. It was as if it had become a complete body part of itself. What's going on? What the hell are these? These world founders had such doubts in their hearts. They had some guesses, but they didn't dare to believe their guesses. In a world of laws, existences that could give them the same feeling did indeed exist. And that was their avatars. As their avatars, they were originally like a part of their bodies and could be considered as part of their bodies. Before this, they gave up on these avatars and completely cut off the connection between them and themselves. This was like giving these body parts freedom. After that, these avatars became independent and became complete on their own. Obviously, it was like their body parts had become complete. It could be said that if they substituted their avatars, the various complicated feelings they felt would all be explained. However, they didn't dare to believe their guesses. There was no other reason than the fact that what was happening in the world of laws at this time was clearly that those existences had begun to obtain considerable authority in the world of laws. They had begun to gradually break away from the restrictions of being just a living being and had begun to gradually reveal their existence to the entire world of laws. Even if this happened to the native creatures of the world of laws, it would be enough to turn the world upside down. It was almost comparable to a slave turning over and becoming a master. If this happened to their avatars, wouldn't it be like an enemy directly robbing the property of their master? It would be understandable if this happened in a place without a master, but it simply subverted their worldview when it happened in the world of laws. It can't be that he has already left, right? At this moment, a world founder suddenly had such a ridiculous thought. However, he quickly discarded this ridiculous idea. After all, this was a simulated state of chaos. Here, where else could the world founders go apart from their own world? Even those simulated chaotic layers required the participation of the world as a unit. Without the world, what were the world founders worth? As a result, the world founders rejected the correct answer without any hesitation. After eliminating the correct answer, the more they thought about it, the more ridiculous and inexplicable the results they obtained were. In the world of laws, the heavenly Tao already knew that there was no need for it to worry about anything that happened to the world of laws. Now, the natural reaction of the world of laws was more than enough to deal with the external invasion. At the very least, the world of laws could be considered to be able to sit back and relax for this time's test. As for what the situation would be like next time, it could only be discussed next time. Hence, it simply began to enter the process of perfecting the embryonic form of its own world. It was the style of not caring about anything that concerned itself to the extreme. This time, the test of the world founders on the world of laws passed unknowingly. They had considered for so long and established 18 plans, but in the end, none of them achieved results that they could accept. In fact, it even had the opposite effect. They used these 18 plans to test the world of laws in order to find out the truth of the world of laws. However, after this test, they found that the world of laws became more and more unfathomable in their eyes. The situation inside seemed to be shrouded in a dense fog. This situation was truly like punching cotton to the many pioneers of the world. They felt like they had used the wrong strength. Is this disdain or powerlessness? After all the test plans were over, many world founders were confused. What they were confused about was naturally not the result of the test, but rather the fact that they hadn't received any warning at all, nor did they receive any counterattacks. Their previous tests of the world of laws didn't trigger any feedback from the world of laws at all. It felt as if the world of laws didn't care about any of their tests at all. How could this not make them feel bewildered? If they were on their own, if an outsider came to test their world and their own strength, they would definitely retaliate with their strongest strength at the first possible moment. They would directly let the outsider feel how big of a mistake it was to offend them. However, the world of laws didn't take any action because of this. It didn't give them any warning or punishment at all. This was completely contrary to their understanding. In the spiritual network, many thoughts were transmitted to each other, constantly discussing the current situation. This kind of discussion naturally couldn't come to a conclusion. The reaction of the world of laws was already there for all to see. Any creator of the world would be able to see it clearly. What a world founder could sense, other world founders could also sense. What a world founder couldn't see, other world founders generally wouldn't be able to see either. In this way, this kind of discussion was like completely ignorant existences discussing with each other to establish the outline of something that was beyond their understanding. It went without saying how small the possibility of success was. As they discussed like this, time gradually passed. Before they knew it, another few decades had passed. During these few decades, the many world founders didn't come up with a result that everyone agreed on. In the end, they only decided on their next course of action. This course of action had actually been determined when the results came out a few decades ago. Since the world of laws didn't impose punishment on them and didn't attack them because of their tests, then of course they could become bolder. Of course, although they could become bolder, it didn't mean that they could do whatever they wanted. It didn't mean that they could completely ignore all rules and carry out tests. It must be known that although the last test wasn't punished or counterattacked, their previous tests had triggered a violent reaction from the other party every time. If they really didn't care about the tolerance range of the world of laws and randomly carried out all kinds of tests, the final result would probably be very regrettable. Such a restriction was naturally nothing to the many pioneers of the world. After all, these world founders were extraordinary themselves, and their grasp of speed could be said to be superb. They had already tried the tests that were punished, and they had also tried the tests that weren't punished. This was equivalent to delineating a division, and the next test could naturally be carried out in those divisions at will. Next, they began to establish hundreds of plans. This time, they didn't plan to divide these hundreds of plans according to the original method, but to carry them out at the same time. The reason why they had to split up and carry out one of the 18 plans each was because they didn't know how strong the counterattack of the world of laws would be. Everyone was deducing based on the premise that they only had one chance. But now, after confirming that the world of laws disdained their probing and wouldn't retaliate against them, the situation was naturally completely different. Since the other party wouldn't counterattack, they could naturally have multiple chances. Since there were so many times, he naturally needed to strengthen each test as much as possible so that he could get as much results as possible from each test. Thus, they naturally made the choice to do everything they could to the extreme every time they tried to test the waters. Moreover, to carry out every test to the extreme, this obviously required sufficient manpower and also required sufficient intelligence to be able to achieve this. Therefore, the final result was that these hundreds of plans gathered all the world founders who participated in the plan. Everyone gave these plans a number and began to implement them one by one according to the number. In terms of perfection alone, these plans naturally couldn't compare to the 18 plans they had previously chosen. After all, if these plans could be compared to the 18 plans, they wouldn't have only chosen those 18 plans back then. However, compared to the 18 plans, these hundreds of plans had an advantage, and that was that they involved more aspects and were more complicated. The 18 plans could be said to be a kind of specialization, but these hundreds of plans were already casting a wide net. It was only when such tests went unpunished that they dared to take out these hundreds of plans. Otherwise, no matter how bold they wouldn't have come up with such a plan that wasn't very perfect to court death. The first plan was quickly prepared by the world founders and was put into action. Chapter 2795. Of course, that was just paying attention. While these beings appeared to be rather intelligent, they did not have much of an organization. It was difficult to believe how clear they were about the situation in this part of the world. At this time, Luo Fan felt that the most important thing to do was to figure out the specific details of this tribulation world. Other things could be delayed and looked at later. Under the influence of this absolute goal, it didn't take long for Luo Fan to find a place where intelligent beings lived that suited his goal. This settlement was located on a plain where various tribulation triggering points formed a strange balance with each other. If this plane was in a normal world, it would definitely be a dangerous place. Even powerful cultivators would not be willing to stay there for long. After all, this place was the land itself, and it was constantly changing. Some places that were extremely peaceful and peaceful at one moment would turn into dangerous places like magma seas in the next. Furthermore, this was only the most ordinary of changes. There were countless changes that were more severe, terrifying, and incomprehensible than this. However, in this part of the world, this place was already a rare place of peace. At the very least, there would not be any sudden collapse of space and time, or an abrupt break in time that separated different parts of the living beings into two different periods of time. Evidently, Luo Fan was not the only one who thought so. The intelligent beings in this part of the world thought so as well. Thus, a place where intelligent life forms resided had appeared. Moreover, it was not just a group of intelligent beings that lived here. There were quite a number of living beings that lived here. These intelligent creatures occupied various parts of this inhabited area, occupying locations that were comparatively calmer and more balanced compared to the plain situation. Just by looking at the distribution of buildings and the settlement of intelligent beings, one could tell that these races were not on good terms. The various defensive and offensive structures were clearly not designed to deal with the natural changes in this settlement. The reason why Luo Fan was certain that the intelligent beings in this settlement could satisfy his requirements was because of these defensive and offensive structures. The mysteries contained within these structures were definitely something that could only be built by a race of beings with relatively high intelligence and a deep understanding of the world. Such a creature's understanding of the world would certainly meet the requirements that Luo Fan wanted to understand. In the blink of an eye, Luo Fan had already landed at the nearest settlement of intelligent creatures. This settlement wasn't built like a town in a normal world. Instead, the entire settlement seemed to exist in a chaotic but rather mysterious state. Many of the residents had their own buildings, and the distance between these buildings and other buildings was not set according to the requirements of the settlement. Instead, it was set according to the surrounding environment. Every building was at the balance of many points of calamity, and was at the point where the powers of many points of calamity intersected. It could be said that every building was the core of an incredibly subtle formation. The many buildings supported and interacted with each other, forming an even larger and more mysterious system. This system seemed to be a formation, but it also seemed to be a simple dynamic balance. There was some kind of indescribable communication between the many buildings at every moment. This communication caused the many buildings to be closely connected, and they constantly released a strange power that could counter the endless changes. The endless changes in the outside world were obviously the changes caused by the countless points of calamity. It was also enough to make this part of the world endlessly dangerous and completely unsuitable for the survival of living beings. The living beings in this settlement did not look like born Taoism aptitudes at all. At least, they did not look very similar to any of the born Taoism aptitudes that existed in the transportation network layer that Luo Fan knew. After all, the number of worlds that existed in the transportation network layer was counted in the hundreds of millions. If the number of worlds was counted in the hundreds of millions, then the types of born Taoism aptitudes would naturally also be counted in the hundreds of millions. Even with such a large base number, the living beings in this settlement were different from any of the other types. This was enough to show just how strange the living beings in this settlement were. Even the living beings in this settlement did not look exactly the same. In fact, the living beings in almost every building had a special characteristic. As long as they left the building, the appearance of the living beings would be fundamentally different. It was as if every building was a perfect world, and the living beings in every building were born Taoism aptitudes that belonged to that perfect world. In fact, this might not be an illusion, but it was very likely to be real. This was because when Luo fans saw the living beings entering and exiting the buildings, their appearances changed quite a bit when they were inside and outside the buildings. The creatures that stepped into the building all had the same appearance, and a large number of them all had the same appearance. After leaving the buildings, the appearances of many living beings began to change. No matter how similar their original appearances were, they became huge in the blink of an eye. This appearance was extremely similar to the appearance of a cultivator who stepped into a perfect world and directly transformed into a perfect world with a born Taoism aptitude. Naturally, it was impossible for the living beings in this settlement to not notice Luo Fan's arrival. In fact, Luo Fan's arrival was like a drop of water dripping in a boiling oil. The commotion caused was unimaginably huge. In just an instant, almost the entire settlement was completely activated. It was unknown how many gazes, how many perceptions, and how many forces were rapidly converging on Luo Fan's location. At the same time, even the many buildings in the settlement were undergoing various subtle adjustments, and they began to work hard to find a new balance. A new balance with Luo Fan's participation. The reason for this was very simple. It was because of the strange state that Luo Fan was in at this moment. One should not forget what kind of state Luo Fan was in at this moment. At this moment, he was in a state under the protection of the light of heaven and earth. And how was the light of heaven and earth protecting him? The light of heaven and earth was completely in response to the various changes that occurred in the outside world. It evolved corresponding changes to neutralize the changes, repulsion, oppression, and suppression of the outside world on Luo Fan. Under such circumstances, the changes of the light of heaven and earth could actually correspond to all the changes that occurred in the place where the light of heaven and earth came into contact with the light of heaven and earth. In other words, at this moment, the area around Luo Fan could actually be counted as a place where the change of heaven and earth completely disappeared. In other words, the original function of this place as a part of the dynamic balance of the settlement had been eliminated. With this function eliminated, the original balance of the settlement was naturally greatly challenged. If this settlement wanted to regain its dynamic balance, then it had to adjust itself, find a new dynamic balance. With this, as soon as Luo Fan stepped into this settlement, every element that previously formed the dynamic balance of this settlement, every unit, had to find their own position in the new dynamic balance. It could even be said that if it wasn't for the fact that this settlement was extremely mysterious, where the balance of every single building could be adjusted at any time, just this sudden change might have been enough to destroy the settlement. It was precisely because of this that this current situation occurred. Just by stepping into this place, Luo Fan reacted like a drop of water falling in a boiling oil. At this moment, Luo Fan did not feel any guilt because of this at all. Instead, he watched with great interest as this settlement underwent extremely complicated and subtle dynamic adjustments. Newcomer, welcome. However, you shouldn't have barged in so recklessly. At this moment, a figure arrived before Luo Fan, speaking in a language that Luo Fan was completely unfamiliar with. Even though this figure seemed a bit humanoid, it was only the general outline that resembled a human a bit. There were many concrete details that didn't have anything to do with the human form. It was to the extent where even the eyes, ears, mouth, and nose that normal people needed weren't a similar combination. Instead, they were constructed in a way that Luo Fan was completely unfamiliar with, a type of perception that only appeared in Luo Fan's imagination, but never truly existed. Even though it was a completely unfamiliar language for existences at Luo Fan's level, as long as there was a language to express a specific meaning, no matter how niche the language was, they would be able to instantly grasp the meaning it was trying to express. Right now, it was naturally no exception. In reality, this type of ability was already an essential ability for creatures of a certain level and above. After all, different worlds followed different worldviews. So how could it be expected that the languages of the creatures would be the same? If such different existences didn't have such an ability to communicate, Wouldn't it be impossible for the creatures of different worlds to understand each other? Obviously, this was of course impossible. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled and said, "I was too rash. I hope your excellency can forgive me." Even though he didn't think that it was a mistake, nor did he feel any guilt because of it, he naturally wouldn't be stingy with words that could solve a problem that could be solved with a few gentle words. After hearing Luo Fan's words, the person seemed to be a little more satisfied and said, "But this isn't your fault. I think it's your first time encountering such a holy land, so it's understandable that you aren't used to the rules here. But now, you need to learn a lot of things before you can move around freely. It's just that all of us are adapting to you now. If you want to be accepted by us, you need to actively participate." Luo Fan rejoiced inwardly. This was like having a pillow when he was sleepy. He wanted to know the secrets of this world, and the other party wanted to impart the most precious knowledge of this world to him. Since that was the case, how could he refuse? He couldn't help but nod his head. To the residents of the settlement, it was a good thing that the settlement could grow stronger. In particular, the addition of Luo Fan, who seemed to be an extraordinary powerhouse, was the best of the best. After all, the situation in this plane was rather complicated. It wasn't like they didn't have any enemies here. The other settlements were obviously their enemies. While they were constantly spying on the other settlements, their settlements were also being spied on at all times. Under such circumstances, as an outsider, Luo Fan was obviously an extremely precious resource. If Luo Fan chose this settlement and was willing to work for it, it would be enough to strengthen the settlement. It might even be able to suppress the other settlements and directly conquer them. As for why they were so sure that Luo Fan was an expert and not an ordinary creature born in this world, the reason was simple. That was because Luo Fan had obviously come from outside the inhabited plains. This world was not like other ordinary worlds. Here, even this settlement was not a place where ordinary cultivators would be willing to stay for a long time. It was easy to imagine how dangerous it was outside the plains. And now, Luo Fan could come from the outside world as if nothing had happened. He didn't even look the slightest bit disheveled. Was this not enough to show that he was an absolute expert? Therefore, at that moment, this person explained in detail how to build the buildings in the settlement, how to balance the environment of the settlement outside, how to adjust the buildings according to the environment, and how to rent the buildings in the settlement to maintain a dynamic balance to Luo Fan. Such explanations naturally couldn't come out of thin air. Instead, he had to explain why each preparation had to be like that. For example, why the buildings needed to take care of a special space-time structure, or why the buildings needed to be suppressed in such a way because the buildings could give birth to living beings, and so on. Chapter 2796. These living beings were the living beings born in this world. Due to the special space-time structure of this world, even they did not know how long it had been since they were born. In their senses, this world seemed to have been born with their ancestors ever since it was born. When their ancestors were born, they were just like the other living beings in this world. They could only struggle to survive in this chaotic world. They struggled to stay alive through the changes in the world, and slowly found out the rules of the tribulations heaven and earth. They kept accumulating knowledge from generation to generation, until the last few generations of this creature were able to gain a stable foothold in the tribulations heaven and earth. In the end, they lived and multiplied here until now. Of course, at this point in time, this world was no longer as chaotic as it used to be. They had gradually comprehended a hidden essence that was different from the normal laws of the world. This essence allowed these beings to borrow the power of the world and use the changing laws of the world. They could even use the changing laws to obtain various kinds of power, allowing the essence of their lives to evolve. In other words, they had even found a cultivation path that was suitable for this world. Of course, this cultivation path was still rather crude for the time being. It was far from perfect, and it clearly required generations of hard work to improve it. It was just like how they built this settlement from scratch in the beginning. Fortunately, they were at a juncture where they needed manpower and wisdom to perfect their cultivation path. Otherwise, they would not have welcomed Luo Fan's arrival so warmly. After all, no matter what, he was an unfamiliar expert from the outside. Facing such an expert, ordinary living beings would definitely be doubtful and cautious. Just like now, they accepted without any misgivings and imparted the experience accumulated over generations without leaving out anything. Only their thirst for the strong was enough to suppress these suspicions and guard against the strong. Only then could it be possible. Adjusting himself to the dynamic balance of this settlement was naturally an extremely simple matter for Luo Fan. One must know that he was an existence that could directly form his own body. He could even create a new world in a simulated state of chaos. For such an existence, controlling and adjusting himself was almost an instinct. Just like what this person was teaching him right now, to adapt to the dynamic balance of the surrounding settlements, so that he would no longer be a burden to this settlement, but instead become an organic part of this settlement. Even though it was complicated, it really wasn't too difficult of an adjustment. Such an adjustment was, of course, extremely simple for him, who had that kind of instinct. That person was soon shocked by the method that Luo Fan displayed. Although the adjustment was not too complicated, one must not forget that it was a method that generations of people had accumulated and created over an endless period of time. Normally, it would take them a few years to master such a method from scratch, no matter how talented they were. It was to the extent where it could be said that every single person here spent their youth trying to adapt to this inhabited land's dynamic balance. It was precisely because they knew that it was rather troublesome to complete such adjustments that the residents of this settlement did not impart the method to Luo Fan at once. Instead, they adjusted their own buildings and their interactions with their surroundings, taking the initiative to adapt to Luo Fan's arrival in this settlement. They first stabilized the place before trying to let Luo Fan learn this method. If they had known that Luo Fan could complete such adjustments so quickly, they would not have wasted so much effort. You really did it? In the end, when Luo Fan had regained his freedom, that person still asked in disbelief. I think you guys know the specifics better than me, right? Luo Fan only smiled faintly. He was in a rather wonderful mood at the moment. That was because through this method of adjustment and the various situations related to this world that the other party described, he had a general understanding of this world. Compared to before, when he was completely clueless about this world, it was already countless times better. Although he still could not understand the nature of this retribution world, and could not understand the nature of this retribution world, he had already taken a huge step in that direction. How could he not be satisfied? That's right, I should know better than you. That person could not help but laugh. Indeed, whether or not Luo Fan had perfectly integrated into the settlement system, whether or not he had re-established a dynamic balance with the settlement, this was something that only the original residents of the settlement knew better. At this moment, many people started to come out. These people had all sorts of strange appearances, and almost none of them looked the same as the others. In fact, there were very few similarities between them. As far as Luo Fan was concerned, almost none of these creatures could satisfy his aesthetic standards. However, similarly, in their eyes, Luo Fan's appearance obviously did not satisfy their aesthetic standards either. As for Luo Fan, he thought that his appearance was normal, while the others had all sorts of strange appearances. In their eyes, this perception was the opposite. However, in this world, in this settlement, there were just too many images that didn't satisfy one's sense of beauty. It was not a big deal to have one more person like Luo Fan. After a series of exchanges, Luo Fan told them his name. To these residents, the addition of Luo Fan was a great expansion of their strength. This caused the residents of this settlement to develop many desires for the other settlements on the plains. It was not easy to find a stable place that could establish dynamic balance in this world. In the eyes of these residents, the few places on this plane were the only ones in this world. The reason why these living beings could not reproduce to their heart's content and could not expand to their heart's content was because of the limitation of resources. Therefore, the residents of any settlement wished for the residents of other settlements to die so that they could occupy those settlements and turn them into their own resources so that they could reproduce to their heart's content and develop to their heart's content. Therefore, when they had enough strength, there was no doubt what their choice would be. Let's set off tomorrow. Jinghai Village has provoked us several times. We can't let them be arrogant anymore. A resident suggested. This resident's body structure was very special. It seemed to be made of bones and spikes. Overall, he looked very dangerous, and people could associate him with battles at a glance. Through the previous introduction, Luo Fan already knew that he was the most warlike person in this village. That's right, these settlements were villages. At the very least, to the living beings of this settlement, their settlement was a village. As for the other settlements, there were also many villages. Jinghai Village was the nearest village to this village. The name of this village was Jiwang Village. As for how it got its name, it was impossible to verify. This warlike person's name was Zhan Wu. The person who spoke to Luo Fan just now was the village chief of Jiwang Village. His name was Morning. Morning just shook his head and said, "Don't be too anxious. They should be the ones who are anxious now. We just need to wait and see." He comforted Zhan Wu, and his expression did not change at all because of Zhan Wu's suggestion. Even this kind of comforting words seemed to come out of his mouth. He seemed to be very used to this kind of comforting words. That's what you say every time. Zhan Wu was delighted. However, it was clear that this person had quite the authority in this Jiwang village. Even though he was already used to this kind of cajoling, he still did not dare to continue pestering him. He could only helplessly curl his lips and put this matter aside for now. Did you only find this settlement plain after so many years? Is there no other place? Luo Fan did not intend to participate in their conversation at this time and asked Morning instead. Morning just shook his head and said no. As far as we know, this is the only plain inhabited by humans. Apart from here, we don't have the ability to build a stable village anywhere else. Then, why is it called a village? Luo Fan only frowned. In the administrative system, a village was obviously the smallest unit. Beneath the village, there were no similar structures to be found. However, above the village, there are small towns, cities, counties, and even bigger ones such as provinces, counties, and countries. Without those above, the saying of a village naturally did not have much meaning. With such a small population, if it's not a village, is it a country? Morning said helplessly. Naturally, he also wanted to be a king. He wanted to be an emperor, but there were only a few hundred households, and they only occupied such a small settlement. They were even threatened by other settlements, so they could not settle down for a long time. In such a place, he could not call himself a king at all. Luo Fan was a little disappointed when he heard that. Then, is there really no bigger settlement above? He did not give up and asked. Maybe there is, but I don't know, Morning said helplessly. At this moment, he could already feel that Luo Fan did not seem to be looking at the village. It seemed like there was no value in staying in the village. No, there must be. At this moment, a voice came from outside the circle of people. This was a short creature with 6 arms and 4 legs. It had 4 eyes on its face, but it exuded a weak aura. Depraved. Don't bring out those vague legends and make a fool of yourself. Morning's expression turned inexplicably ugly as he shouted. His expression turned ugly, not because he could see it, but because he sensed it. After all, his appearance and appearance were completely different from Luo Fan's taste, so it was difficult to distinguish his expression at first glance. No, that's not an illusory legend. It's history. That's true history. The man called Tome of Evil yelled at this moment. Have you found any evidence after so many days? It's just a legend without any evidence. Morning was even more unhappy. Luo Fan's eyes lit up at this moment. Friend Depraved, why don't you come in and have a good talk? He immediately called out. Although he was only a newcomer in this village, his strength was enough for him to surpass the newcomer stage and gain a considerable say in this village. Although he called out to Depraved, he could not directly contradict him. At this moment, he could only frown and watch Depraved squeeze in. You're the newcomer this time, right? Are you interested in higher-level settlements? Depraved asked excitedly after seeing Luo Fan. That's right. I'm very interested in higher-level settlements. Friend, do you have any clues? Luo Fan asked directly. This was what he was really thinking, and he had no intention of hiding it from the others. Moreover, it did not seem like he could hide it. As long as he stayed here, the others would naturally be able to tell what he was thinking. Don't be fooled by him, Luo fan. That kind of thing is actually just an illusory legend. There has never been any evidence of the existence of a larger, higher-level settlement. Morning said hurriedly. There was a hint of anxiety in his words. That's right, that's right. Depraved is actually possessed by the devil. What he said is actually not credible. The others continued to chime in at this moment. Aren't you guys afraid that Luo fan will find clues and abandon this village because of his powerful combat strength? How could you say such shameful things? Depraved shouted at this moment. Were shameful things? Don't you feel guilty saying that? Are you afraid that he will think that what you said is illusory and meaningless? So you deliberately emphasize the value of those words? Did you deliberately create those things here to prove that they really exist? Morning said angrily. However, although he was angry, Morning did not do anything to drive Depraved away. Obviously, this Depraved either had a special identity or special strength. Chapter 2797. Luo fan was naturally happy to see them argue. After all, it was related to what he was looking for, the possible existence of settlements such as towns in this world. It would be best if he could figure out what he wanted to figure out during their argument. However, although he was happy to see them argue, it would be a little too much if the argument went beyond a certain limit and turned into a fight. Therefore, at this moment, seeing that they were getting more and more stiff and were about to fight, Luo fan said, "Everyone, there's no need to argue. I'm interested in all legends. Even if there's a high possibility that it's fake, I won't reject it." Upon hearing this, Desolate's body froze. At this time, since he had already said so, there was naturally no need to continue arguing. Unless he wanted to fall out with Luo fan, he could only let Evil Codex talk nicely. At this moment, Evil Codex had an inexplicable look of hope on his face. Obviously, he was not as confident in the so-called legend as he appeared to be. At this moment, he was still looking forward to getting some encouragement from Luo fan. Desolate gave Evil Codex a warning look, as if he wanted him to stop talking nonsense. However, it was obvious that his warning was nothing to Evil Codex. Seeing that Evil Codex and Luo fan were together, the other villagers were a little disappointed. However, they did not completely despair. At this time, they stayed by the side and waited for the development of the situation to see if Luo fan would really be persuaded by Evil Codex and leave Jiwang village. Zhan Wu, who was at the side, wished that he could immediately pounce over and subdue Evil Codex to prevent such an outcome. Evil Codex looked around. Without doing anything, a strange wave surged out from his body and began to interact with the surrounding environment subtly. During this interaction, a subtle barrier gradually appeared between him and Luo fan, separating them from the outside world. Faced with this action, Luo fan only glanced at it and did not pay too much attention. After all, Evil Codex's behavior was at most cautious. He was not guarding against Lin Huang, but the villagers. In that case, why should he stop him? As for the villagers, they were on the verge of exploding. What did he mean by that? He clearly didn't trust them. There were a few impulsive ones who wanted to break the barrier. However, Morning was still more stable, and it stopped them from moving. The reason for this was naturally because he knew that there was no way to stop this anymore. What Luo fan would decide in the future was up to him. Even if they found a way to stop the Book of Evil, would Luo fan still be unable to figure out the legends? This was obviously impossible. Since those legends were legends, they naturally spread far and wide. How could they prevent others from knowing about something that had spread far and wide? At this time, if Evil Codex made things clear, he could still leave some friendship and let Luo fan owe them a favor. But if he kept sabotaging and obstructing them, then there would be no friendship at all. At that time, perhaps Luo fan would attack them out of anger. How could he do something like this that would create enmity in order to win over the other party? After the barrier appeared, they could not hear the conversation between Evil Codex and Luo fan. Of course, if they wanted to, they could forcibly break through the barrier to find out and eavesdrop on them. However, it was like a person closing the door to his room. A door certainly could not stop someone with ulterior motives. However, if one really barged in recklessly, it would obviously offend that person. Obviously, Morning and the others would not do such a thing. At this moment, they could only watch Evil Codex and Luo Fan have a long conversation inside the barrier. The flow of time in this world was an extremely strange state of existence. Even in this settlement that was already barely stable, it wasn't absolutely stable. Occasionally, there would be situations in this village where only one night had passed, but the outside world had already changed. Even the balance of the entire village had changed. Sometimes, there were even villagers who had been reborn from the future and time traveled from the past. Under such circumstances, they had no idea how long Evil Codex and Luo Fan had been talking. Morning felt that they had only been talking for a few hours, but the people beside them felt that they had only been talking for a few breaths, while some felt that they had been talking for a few days. Evidently, even if they were standing in the same place, the flow of time between them was different. It was also because of this that they had no idea how long Evil Codex and Luo Fan had been talking. All they knew was that the barrier had gradually disappeared, and Evil Codex and Luo Fan appear in front of them with a thoughtful look on their faces. Morning hurriedly cast aside his guesses about how long they had been talking to each other. He went forward and asked nervously, "So, Luo Fan, what's your decision?" Upon hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled and said, "I plan to stay in this village for some time and leave when the golden mist appears." Morning felt helpless and happy at the same time. He felt helpless because this meant that Luo Fan already knew about the legends, which meant that he could leave at any time. On the other hand, he was happy because this also proved that Luo Fan was willing to help this village for a period of time. The golden mist was a natural phenomenon in this world. Or perhaps it was a natural phenomenon that they knew. The time of this natural phenomenon was not fixed, but it would appear from time to time. When it appeared, the entire world within their field of vision would be shrouded in the golden mist. This golden mist had an extremely unique nature. It seemed to be time, space, rules, and laws. It could be seen, but no matter what method was used, it could not be touched. It was impossible to determine how long this golden mist could last. Perhaps the time it appeared was fixed, but in this world, even if two existences were standing face to face, their time could not be equated. Under such circumstances, it was a mystery how long the golden mist had been present in the sky. According to the ancient legends, when the golden mist appeared, a path would be opened. This path would lead to an incredibly vast continent. That continent was more stable than any place in the world that they knew of. There were countless living beings that formed countries and created incredible cultivation civilizations. It was said that some powerhouses had transcended the world and could destroy the world with a finger. Since ancient times, countless people had explored the golden mist and left behind many legends that were unknown whether they were true or false. However, according to those records, even those who were closest to that path could only see its shadow from afar. No one had actually stepped into it. Moreover, those existences that explored the golden mist seemed to have been stimulated by something after their exploration. They did not care about anything outside the golden mist and only wanted to pursue the path in the golden mist and the vast continent behind it. This kind of existence was obviously an existence that was despised by the people in this inhabited area. After all, to this settlement, cooperation was the norm. This kind of cooperation was necessary for survival. On the other hand, those that did not cooperate with others and only wanted to pursue illusory legends were obviously just burdens and would naturally be despised. Evil Codex, for example, was obviously such an existence. If not for the fact that Evil Codex knew his own limits and did not blindly explore the golden mist and was occasionally willing to help Zhuang village fight against other villages, he might have been abandoned long ago. Previously, the conversation between Luo Fan and Evil Codex was about the many records and legends. Since Evil Codex wanted to pursue the path behind the golden mist, he naturally paid great attention to information about it. In fact, the information he gathered was many times more than what Luo Fan had expected. If he were to describe it in words, the information would probably be counted in the hundreds of millions. Their conversation did not last as long as the people outside thought. Instead, it only lasted for a few short days. During these few days, Luo Fan had completely absorbed all the books and information that Evil Codex knew. In fact, he even vaguely concluded that apart from Evil Codex, there were some patterns that he could not find. In fact, from the many legends, it could be confirmed that the golden mist appeared with a pattern. After it appeared, it would usually cause a drastic change in the environment. For a period of time after the golden mist, the settlement would become even more stable. In fact, it could even be said that the appearance of the settlement was caused by the golden mist. At the very least, Luo Fan had been observing this world for such a long time, but he had not seen such a golden mist appearing anywhere else in this world. In this place, the golden mist had already accumulated so many legends. Under such circumstances, he did not believe that the golden mist had nothing to do with the settlement. But is there really another continent? This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Rationally, he did not dare to believe that such a continent existed. After all, this cataclysm world was truly too chaotic and dangerous. Even though there were so many villages in this settlement, he felt that it was rare. His rationality naturally could not accept the existence of a continent that was broader and could even form a country and give birth to an unbelievable cultivation civilization. However, emotionally, he was obviously looking forward to the existence of that continent. After all, as long as that continent existed, the truth of this world would almost be completely revealed to him. Once he was able to step onto that continent, he would be able to transcend this world and find the essence of the tribulation level through this world. All of this would be a step closer to him. The golden mist would only appear for a fixed period of time. However, for the residents of this settlement, and even for the buildings within, this time was completely random. According to the Book of Evil, the last time the golden mist appeared was 3 years ago. However, if he were to ask other people in this village, he would find that almost no one would say that the golden mist appeared 3 years ago. It was not that they were unwilling to tell this fact to Luo Fan, but according to their timeline, the golden mist did not appear 3 years ago at all. In this case, the time the golden mist appeared 3 years ago, as described by Evil Codex, was obviously not of much use as a reference. It could be said that the next golden mist could appear at the next moment, or it could appear infinitely far in the future. As for when exactly it would appear, it would depend on Luo Fan's luck, or in other words, it would depend on his location. The reason why Evil Codex was so eager to tell Luo Fan about this was not because he did not have a wish. What he wanted was to follow Luo Fan into the golden mist, explore the path, and search for that continent. Evil Codex was just an ordinary villager in Jiwang Village. He was even weaker than the other villagers because he had buried himself in the illusory ancient books and legends. Without the help of others, it would be a suicide mission for him to leave the village, let alone explore the golden mist. Under such circumstances, although he had searched through many books and heard many legends, he had never once explored the golden fog. This had even become his inner demon, and he could not calm down for a long time. This time, Luo Fan's arrival was like a path to the heavens for him. Don't forget how Luo Fan had appeared. He had come in from the outside. Before this, he had not even appeared in the entire settlement plains. For such an existence, it was obvious that the environment of the outside world was not much of a problem to him. Walking between heaven and earth was obviously just his basic ability. Under such circumstances, exploring the golden mist was obviously not a problem for him. Chapter 2798. In the following days, Luo Fan was like a very ordinary villager in Jiwang Village and began to live in the village. Of course, as a villager, he naturally needed to prepare his own building. After all, it was not a problem to use himself as a fulcrum to adapt to the dynamic balance of the surroundings in a short period of time. But if it continued for a long time, it would be inappropriate no matter how one looked at it. Since he had made the decision to stay in Zhuang village for a short period of time, Luo Fan naturally would not have the idea of distinguishing himself from the other villagers. Therefore, the building was naturally necessary. As for the building he created, it was like a world of its own, which greatly broadened the horizons of many villagers. They even felt that their perception of the world and the predestined world had undergone earth-shattering changes. Because of this, they changed their original plan to attack Jinghai village as soon as possible and bring out the greatest value of Luo Fan before he left as quickly as possible. Instead, they began to meditate and carefully experience the building that Luo Fan had created. It was because doing so could make them feel that they had gained more benefits. Subduing Jinghai village and making the territory of Jinghai village their new territory would indeed bring them a lot of benefits. It would at least double the resources of Zhuang village, so that each of the villagers could share the benefits brought by the increase in resources. But at the same time, it was also dangerous. After all, Jinghai village was not an empty place without any ability to resist. That village could pose such a great threat to Zhuang village before, and even made it difficult for Zhuang village to extend its tentacles out of the village. This was enough to show how powerful Jinghai village was. Now, although Zhuang village had an expert like Luo Fan, who seemed to be much stronger than before, who knew whether the strength of Zhuang village would be able to absolutely crush Jinghai village with Luo Fan's help before the real fight began. If something went wrong, and their strength did not grow enough, how much would they suffer when they attacked Zhuang village? How much damage would they suffer? This kind of loss might be acceptable to the village. But for the villagers who had suffered losses, it was unacceptable. Therefore, at this time, when they found that the buildings built by Luo Fan could bring them enough benefits and help them improve enough, how could they still be willing to provoke a dispute and fight with Jinghai village? At the very least, before they completely digested the mysteries contained in this building and completely absorbed the benefits that Luo Fan revealed, they would never do such a foolish thing. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan was naturally satisfied. Although he didn't find it difficult to fight for the sake of his village, it was still a little troublesome. If he could avoid it, it would be best not to do it. At this time, it would be great if they could use this random building to replace the battle. Hence, he did not refuse any of the villagers' requests to view and comprehend his building. Even Zhan Wu had practically settled down in his building and did not want to leave. Although it was just a building, it looked like an ordinary house at first glance. But in fact, the fact that a building could exist in this doomed world meant that it was extraordinary. Even though this building was located in a plain, inhabited area, it was still the same. At first glance, this building looked like a bungalow, but if one looked closely, they would find that there was a huge space in the bungalow. It would be an exaggeration to say that this space was wider than a world, but it was definitely more than enough to accommodate tens of millions of people. Therefore, not to mention the fact that there were only hundreds of villagers in Jingwang village, even if there were millions of them, there would not be any pressure on this building. Because it was a building built by Luo Fan, the space-time rules in this building were naturally determined according to Luo Fan's wishes. At least, any villager who stepped into this building would naturally have a humanoid appearance that met Luo Fan's aesthetic standards. For Luo Fan, this kind of change made the creatures in his eyes more pleasing to the eye. However, for other creatures, it was like fixing themselves into the shape of a monster. After all, to them, a humanoid appearance was just a monster that did not meet their aesthetic standards at all. Fortunately, they were already used to entering other buildings that didn't conform to their aesthetic standards, so they weren't averse to the fact that they were transformed into monsters. Otherwise, perhaps not many of them would be willing to stay here. Because they were all in this building, the flow of time was naturally unified, and it completely followed the flow of time in Luo Fan's self-perception. In Luo Fan's perception, time flowed by slowly, and in the blink of an eye, 30 years had passed. For the villagers of Jiwang village, these 30 years were simply the best 30 years since they were born. In fact, it could even be said to be the best 30 years in Jingwang village's history. This was because during these 30 years, they could feel their knowledge growing at every moment. They could feel their essence improving, and they could feel their understanding of the essence of the world becoming stronger. This seemed unbelievable. After all, Luo Fan had previously understood the essence of the world through them, and understood the various phenomena of the world. However, now, he had turned the tables and allowed the villagers to benefit from him in this aspect. However, it was obvious that it was only natural for such a situation to occur. Luo Fan's realm was obvious, and his essence was clearly billions of times better than the villagers of Jingwang Village. With this realm, anything in his hands would be far more effective than in the hands of the villagers. No matter what appearance appeared before him, he could use an extraordinary method to dig out the essence hidden within. It was the same for this world. Before this, the only thing that limited him was his understanding of the world, which was only the appearance of the world. Because he could not see the appearance of the world clearly, he could not dig further into the essence of the world. However, when the residents of the world sorted out the appearance that far surpassed what Luo Fan could see in front of Luo Fan, the deep truths and mysteries hidden under the appearance were no longer secrets to him. As for things that weren't secret, he could naturally reveal them as he pleased. This would allow the villagers, who could only see the surface, to gain a lot. On this day, Luo Fan suddenly had a thought and exited the building that he had created. When he came out to take a look, boundless golden fog covered his entire field of vision. As far as the eye could see, both the sky and the earth were shrouded in golden mist. This fog was extremely dense. If it was not for Luo Fan's extremely shocking senses, perhaps the fog alone would have been enough to make him unable to see his surroundings clearly. It's finally here. After waiting for 30 years, the golden fog finally appeared in the world again. 30 years was not a long time for him, but when the answer was right in front of him, it seemed extraordinarily long. Therefore, Luo Fan did not stay idle during these 30 years. In fact, during these 30 years, he did not stop exploring the mysteries of the golden fog at all, as well as the mysteries of the path behind the golden fog. Wait for the golden fog to appear before exploring? He might have done this when his cultivation base was extremely low. However, that was clearly not the time now. To him now, as long as there was a trace of a clue, he would dare to expand it into a vast world. After knowing about the existence of the golden fog and the path, how could he not want to explore the existence of the path before the golden fog appeared, so that he could avoid waiting for an indefinite amount of time? After all, for someone as confident as Luo Fan, knowing about these was actually considered a rather obvious clue. However, it was clear that the profundity of the golden fog was beyond his imagination, and the obscurity of the path was also much greater than he had imagined. Under such circumstances, one could imagine how much he had gained in the process. Perhaps it was because of his exploration over the years that he had gained a deeper understanding of the inhabited planes, and his understanding of the essence of this world had also deepened. However, he could not find any trace of his true target, the path behind the golden fog. It was as if it was just an illusory legend that had no credibility at all. This situation continued until now, until the golden mist once again permeated the world at this moment. Luo Fan stood in front of the building he had created and looked at the golden fog that filled the world. He knew that it was time for him to leave Jiwang Village. At this moment, Evil Cannon also discovered the appearance of the golden fog through his own means. Not long after, he rushed out of the fog and arrived in front of Luo Fan. After arriving in front of Luo Fan, Evil Cannon did not waste any time and asked directly, "When do we start?" "Right away," Luo Fan replied calmly. He did not have any worries in Jiwang Village. As for the help that Jiwang Village had given him, it was more than enough for him to repay it with the building behind him. In fact, if one were to measure it with a stricter and more precise standard, Jiwang Village might have profited. Under such circumstances, he naturally would not feel any psychological pressure to leave Jiwang Village directly. Evil Cannon was naturally overjoyed by this answer. He had already made up his mind a long time ago and made a choice between Jiwang Village and his own curiosity. At this moment, He welcomed Luo Fan's decision with open arms. At this moment, Morning and the others seemed to have sensed something. They walked out of the building that Luo Fan had created and looked at Luo Fan reluctantly. For them, Luo Fan's body was equivalent to having countless treasures buried in it. Even if it was just a small amount, it would be enough to bring them huge benefits. Now that the treasures were about to fly away, how could they not feel reluctant? Time's up. As we agreed, I'm leaving. Luo Fan turned around and smiled at Morning. Although the tone was gentle, it naturally contained an unchangeable and unbending determination. Everyone could clearly feel how firm and unshakable the thoughts of the existence who spoke these words were. Morning opened his mouth a few times, but in the end, he could only sigh and say, "Take care." As he spoke, he looked at the building that Luo Fan had created behind him reluctantly. Even though he had experienced the building for 30 years, he still could not understand it. It was difficult for him to absorb the essence and mysteries within it. Now that Luo Fan had left, it seemed impossible to keep it. They would not have the chance to experience the mysteries within it. Don't worry, I'll stay here. Perhaps I can use it as a memory. Luo Fan smiled. Morning's eyes lit up when he heard that. With this thing, they could continue to experience it. Although it was much worse than leaving Luo Fan behind, it was already a blessing in disguise. At the very least, it meant that they could use this method to continue to improve. Thank you. Morning bowed at Luo Fan without hesitation to express his gratitude. Luo Fan did not say much. He merely nodded and entered the golden mist with the evil book. In the beginning, Morning and the others could still vaguely sense some auras leaving. However, they soon realized that they had completely lost all traces of Luo Fan and the evil book. Whether it was the aura or the sound, it was the same. Their surroundings returned to its original peaceful state of being shrouded by the golden mist. As he stepped into the golden mist, there seemed to be a mysterious force enveloping his body. It made Luo Fan feel like he was moving in the deep sea. What a mysterious mist. Luo Fan could not help but sigh after he entered the mist and studied it for a long time. This mist was quite subtle, but it was not like what Luo Fan had previously thought, where it had emerged from. In fact, the appearance of the two could even be said to complement each other. Neither could be dispensed with. Without the golden mist, the path might not have been formed. Without the path, the golden mist might not have been maintained. Chapter 2799. The golden mist's form of existence was extremely mysterious. It was not a physical substance, nor was it energy. It was not even space-time, laws, or worlds. It was a form of existence that even Luo Fan could not define. At this moment, the golden mist gave him the feeling that the world had suddenly turned into a golden cover. Upon hearing Evil Codex's words, Luo Fan nodded calmly. Naturally, he already knew about this when he was collecting information about the golden mist. Although the golden mist was said to be mist, it was in fact just an appearance. From a fundamental point of view, it had nothing in common with the mist itself. As soon as it appeared, it almost ignored all obstructions and covered everything in the inhabited plains. Under such circumstances, it could be said that the entire inhabited plains was within the golden mist. If there was anything outside the golden mist, it would probably be outside the inhabited plains. However, it was obvious that things outside the inhabited plains were naturally rather distant to Evil Codex. Therefore, the things outside the golden mist could not possibly be outside the golden mist in space-time. Instead, it was the world before the golden mist appeared. In other words, under normal circumstances, the many living beings that appeared in the inhabited plains before the golden mist appeared would not be able to survive. The fact that so many villages could be born in the inhabited plains proved that the environment here was superior. Evidently, intelligent beings were not the only ones who could sense the superiority of the environment. Living beings without much intelligence might be even more sensitive to this than intelligent beings. After all, living beings without much intelligence relied more on their instincts, while intelligent beings relied more on their intelligence. As for their perception of the environment, it was obvious that their instincts were more sensitive. As a result, there had always been a large number of other living beings in the plains. In fact, living beings without much intelligence could be said to be the hunting targets of many villages in the inhabited plains. They were also a part of the source of resources. Even if these living beings without much intelligence were essentially the same as those with intelligence, the difference between them and not having intelligence had completely separated them, turning them into the hunter and the hunted. Being able to sort out the wisdom of the path of cultivation was a great advantage for those living beings without much wisdom. In the past, the unintelligent creatures in the plains did not pose much of a threat to the intelligent creatures. In fact, if it wasn't for the fact that these unintelligent creatures were continuously gathering here from the outside world, they might have already wiped out all the low-level intelligent creatures in the inhabited plains. However, it was clear that the situation had changed due to the presence of the golden fog. The golden mist wasn't only effective on low-level intelligent creatures. Once the golden mist was born, those creatures would leap up from the bottom of the food chain to the top of the food chain. Before the golden mist appeared, they were nothing but prey to intelligent beings. However, after the appearance of the golden mist, they became much stronger and reached a point where they were superior to highly intelligent creatures. Once such a creature rushed into a village, it would be a huge challenge for any village. Because of this, once the golden mist appeared, the villages would activate layers of defenses to prevent the creatures from rushing into the village and destroying it. As for leaving the village and stepping into the depths of the golden mist to search for the illusory path, nobody would do that unless they were not afraid of death or had a shocking obsession. Of course, this didn't mean that these creatures were all the dangers in the golden mist. The creatures that had become more than 10 times stronger and leaped from the bottom of the food chain to the top were only a small part of the many dangers in the golden mist. In fact, it could be said that they were only an insignificant small part. In the golden mist, there were even more dangers that could not be described with words, let alone recorded in information. Compared to those dangers, the creatures that could be found, resisted, and knew how to harm people were actually nothing. Of course, this didn't mean that they didn't need to care about those creatures. The reason why these creatures weren't much of a threat was because they were the easiest type of threat to understand and the easiest to defend against. However, it didn't mean that they could really be ignored. If they really ignored it, then what awaited them in the end was that they would die an unknown death not long after entering the golden fog. Of course, in reality, the threat of such creatures was the only threat that could be effectively defended against in the golden mist. As for the other illusory threats, even if one knew of their existence, one wouldn't know how to defend against them or how to avoid them before they appeared. At this moment, Luo Fan raised his senses to the maximum and tried his best to sense everything around him. All of his senses were greatly suppressed in the golden mist. Initially, he could see everything within a range of 100 trillion kilometers with just a glance. He could even grasp many secrets hidden in the depths of time and space within a range of hundreds of trillion kilometers with just a slight release of his senses. In fact, he could even distinguish all the scents within a range of 100 trillion kilometers with just a slight sniff. He could even use these scents to build a world of scents and see everything within a range of 100 trillion kilometers in his mind. However, at that moment, all of his senses were being suppressed to the extreme. Although it wasn't to the point where he couldn't sense anything outside of his body, the range of his senses had been suppressed to a range of only 10,000 kilometers from his original range of 100 trillion kilometers. This was like a person who had strong eyesight of 5. 3 points, suddenly discovering that he had become short-sighted and was thousands of degrees blind. In fact, the difference was even greater if one were to compare the shrinkage ratio. This was naturally a rather uncomfortable feeling for Luo Fan. At this moment, he felt like he was being locked up by layers of shackles. He felt extremely uncomfortable all over his body. The range of his senses had been suppressed by countless times, and he felt like he was being locked up by countless shackles. However, if Evil Codex knew that he could actually sense within 10,000 kilometers, he would definitely be extremely shocked and excited that he had chosen to explore the golden mist with Luo Fan. This was because Evil Codex's senses in the golden mist were even worse than an ordinary person's. Compared to Luo Fan, who could still sense within 10,000 kilometers despite being suppressed, Evil Codex could not see anything beyond 3 meters. He couldn't even hear the voices 3 meters away. 3 meters against 10,000 kilometers. The difference was so huge that it was enough to find a glimmer of hope in the impossible. A glimmer of hope to figure out the truth behind the golden mist and find all the secrets within it. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan was not interested in showing off his abilities to him, especially when he was being suppressed so miserably and felt extremely unhappy. A range of 10,000 kilometers was nothing compared to this plane. Although this plane was only an insignificant dot in this tribulation heaven and earth, it was still an insignificant existence. Its surface area was also calculated in billions of kilometers. A range of 10,000 kilometers was not much bigger than a dot compared to this plane. Naturally, there were many living beings within this range. At this time, these creatures had already undergone the inevitable changes of the creatures in the golden mist under Luo Fan's eyes. Powerful auras kept emerging from all over the place. These auras were so powerful that they could even be compared to ordinary creators of the world. Such a level of strength was enough to suppress 99% of the villagers in any village. In the past, such a massive aura would naturally be enough to make the surrounding villages vigilant. However, at this moment, Evil Codex still could not sense those living beings, even though he was already within this range of 10,000 kilometers. To him, it was as if these incomparably enormous auras did not exist. They did not arouse his vigilance at all. Evidently, his perception of auras had been completely suppressed by the golden mist. At this moment, he could not sense the terrifying auras that were close at hand at all. Although Luo Fan was not in a good mood, he did not have the intention to directly destroy these living beings. Therefore, he consciously bypassed the locations of these living beings and explored other areas. With a range of 10,000 miles, he only needed to be in a certain location to be able to clearly sense everything that was happening in that location. He could naturally grasp the existence of the path and the abnormality that he needed to look for in an instant. Therefore, this kind of search did not require much skill for Luo Fan. Previously, he had already guessed that the golden mist had some kind of subtle connection with this plane. Since that was the case, the most likely location of the golden mist would naturally be a relatively special location on this plane. A special location on a plane was, of course, the easiest place to think of was the center of the plane. At this moment, Luo Fan had no concept of the existence of the path at all, and there was no information that could tell him where the path was. Therefore, he naturally went to the most likely location that he felt was the most likely. Although many aspects were suppressed in the golden mist, the suppression of strength was far inferior to the suppression of perception. Therefore, even the evil tome was quite powerful in the golden mist. At the very least, flying in the sky and burrowing into the ground was not a problem for him. Therefore, they naturally did not need to use their feet to measure the ground, and instead flew in the sky. In the beginning, Evil Codex could still know that he was heading in a certain direction, but he soon lost even this sense of direction. He felt that he had completely lost everything he could rely on, as if he and Luo Fan were the only two people left in the world. Apart from the two of them, there was only the golden mist. As for the location of the village, it had completely disappeared without a trace and could no longer be found. If Evil Dean was here alone, he could only resign himself to his fate at this moment. Even though he had already thrown caution to the wind and was determined to find the answer, even if he had to sacrifice his life, Evil Codex could not help but feel a strong sense of fear in his heart, and his expression became inexplicably ugly. Luo Fan naturally did not care about the changes in his mentality. As he moved forward, his expression became more and more grave. The golden mist suppression of his sense of direction was also effective on him, but his perception still had a range of 10,000 miles even after it was suppressed. The suppression of his sense of direction could not really make him lose his sense of direction. Therefore, the direction he was moving forward was completely under his control. In other words, he was heading toward the center of the plane. Under such circumstances, he should have been relaxed. But in reality, everything that he had sensed made him unable to relax at all. Everything in the retribution world was a tribulation trigger point. Whether it was a grain of sand under his feet, a living being like Evil Codex that was beside Luo, Fan, time, space, laws, and even the golden mist that filled the world, there were actually countless tribulation trigger points that were constructed in various indescribable ways. The countless tribulation trigger points felt like atoms, neutrons, protons, electrons, or some other basic units in a certain technological world. Although their numbers were limited, the world that they formed was infinitely vast, infinitely complicated, and contained infinite mysteries. This had originally become common sense, and Luo Fan gradually accepted it. However, at this moment, as he moved toward the center of the plane and sensed more and more low-level intelligent living beings, Luo Fan discovered that things were gradually changing. The tribulation trigger points that made up many things seemed to be absorbing something frantically, and they were gaining indescribable growth. This growth made those living beings stronger and stronger. At the same time, they gradually gained some characteristics that should not have appeared on them. Some characteristics that belonged to the tribulation trigger points. All living beings, without exception, were experiencing the same thing. It must be known that countless tribulation trigger points were changing at the same time. There were naturally countless possible outcomes from the changes of the countless tribulation trigger points.